So you're looking at, Iraqi, Kurdish, Syrian, American military perspectives, as well as Yazidis that have been taken as sex slaves, as well as refugees, displaced people, the terrorists themselves. I interviewed a number of them, terrorist wives. So I'm really just trying to piece together how people view this situation and what happens, and kind of pull out some of those details and those really human stories that I think get really overlooked in a very sanitized news format. What is everyday like when you're dealing with this? When you have to leave your home, what do you take with you? What do you tell your children about why you are leaving? How do you explain, why your religion is targeted? I just tried to kind of understand a lot of the burning questions I think can help us paint a broad picture of a situation without sort of copious sort of statistics, which I think, again, sanitize the situation and remove us from what's happening.
Welcome to Mic Drop, the podcast where relevancy is irrelevant and we don't give a shit about your feelings. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, it's both an honor and a pleasure to welcome my next guest to the podcast. She's been a journalist for the last 14 years, a war correspondent and writer focusing predominantly on the Middle East for the last 7 of those. She is the author of Only Cry for the Living, and investigative reporter-wise, she actually walks around with Geraldo Rivero's balls in her purse. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage, Hollie McKay.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Thanks for coming. I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule. I know the book just came out a week ago, and you're on the Whirlwind tour, and you stayed a couple extra days to accommodate my schedule to be on here, so I really appreciate that.
It's a pleasure.
I'd like to take a quick second to shout out and thank our sponsor for today's podcast, Origin Labs and Jocko Fuel. Jocko Fuel is a great product. He's got a ton of products, actually, within the Jocko Fuel line. The guests and I enjoy them on the show. And outside, I take a lot of the supplements. I've got some of the Origin Lab jeans, boots, gis, and it's just all around American industry. They do a fantastic job really re-revolutionizing American industry from start to finish. It's all American made, all American sourced. Everything start to finish is made right there in-house, and they really do a phenomenal job creating the products and fulfilling the whole ball of wax. They've been a huge supporter of the Mic Drop podcast for a while now, and I really can't thank Jocko Fuel and Origin Labs enough for the job that they do for us, and so thank you to you guys. I'd like to take a second to shout out our newest sponsor, which is Project Warpath. This is a Navy SEAL-owned company that provides apparel with a pretty edgy feel, and it's a good friend of mine that runs it out of California, and just overall a great outfit. They've got a whole line of different shirts. One of which is arguably my favorite, which is Epstein didn't kill himself. Wonder where that one came from. And but yeah, there's Hillary Clinton killed my friends. There's a bunch of pretty edgy and cool patriotic sayings on T-shirts with good design, good high quality, and it's one that I'm actually wearing right now. So I appreciate them sponsoring the show. Again, that's Project Warpath. You can get all their stuff online, and the shipping and customer service is top notch, quality product, and you're supporting a veteran-owned business. So shout out to Project Warpath. Go check their stuff out. I'd also like to say thank you to our other sponsor, Resilience Premium CBD. Resilience is excited to offer all Mic Drop listeners a 20% off discount on all products for 2 weeks from when this podcast is live, using the discount code MICDROP at checkout. That's 2 words, Mic Drop at checkout. I'd also like to say that Resilience is a great company that works in conjunction with Trico CBD, and all military veterans and first responders receive 35% off. Yes, that's 35% off for all military veterans and first responders, and that's through the Military and First Responders Program. You just have to sign up at resilientcbd.com/military first responders discount. In terms of about Resilience, generally speaking, it's a premium CBD that I use. Again, it works in conjunction with the Tricos brand for the everyday athlete. That's www.resilientcbd.com. And Resilience was really born with the founders who are military veterans as well, personally experienced the effects and impact that CBD had on their own mental and physical obstacles. Their focus was sharper, mental stress was calmed, fitness stamina increased, and their bodies felt less pain, inflammation after super intense workouts. A lot of times most people and people are able to either wean off entirely or significantly reduce pain management therapy. This is a shared vision among the founders that this incredible supplement had not only changed their lives, but had the power to provide unbelievable benefits to family, friends, athletes, fellow veterans, and ultimately the entire fitness community. So big shout out to Resilience for their product as well as the Trico stuff. We sure appreciate their support. What was your favorite Syrian food that you ate while you were there? I know it was slim pickings, but of what you had, what was the one thing that stuck out?
You know, I like the kibbeh, which is the raw liver.
Really?
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of those sort of organ meats and stuff like that. And then just the good old kebab, good old barbecue kebab.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I love Middle Eastern food. I love all of it.
Did you grow up eating organ meats at all?
One of my earliest memories was my mother cooking kidney one time and just completely gagging and thinking it was the most disgusting thing. And what was that? But yes, but it was more. And then it didn't really develop a taste for it all. And then in the Middle East, it was all the time. I remember in Yemen, that was all I could find to cook was liver.
Yeah.
So I was at this little compound and they would cook liver breakfast, lunch and dinner, and I thought it was great and everyone else was complaining about it and I just thought it was great. So I think I really acquired the organ meat taste from the Middle East.
Yeah, I know. Like I didn't grow up eating much of it, and so it's hard for me to get used to. It's very metallic-y and gamey, and it's just very strong flavor that I still I would say don't particularly enjoy. Like I have to mix it with things to eat it, but it's so good for you, provided it comes from a relatively healthy animal. It's just so important to eat.
Is.
But what's the most beautiful place that you've ever been to in your professional career?
There's so much in Iraq that I do really love, but what really stands out for me is the Panjshir Valley in Afghanistan. It's sort of this little oasis in the middle of the madness, and it just everything was very peaceful, and you had the water and you had just people that were just kind of picnicking, and everything was so emerald. And I just remember looking over in the mountains, and even then it was summertime, so things had started to get pretty hot and dry, and even then it was just this kind of beautiful mystical place that it was this sort of little oasis. And I thought if it was anywhere else but Afghanistan, it would be the perfect holiday destination.
Yeah. Even amongst all the madness that was going on, people were just kicking back and picnicking. And
Panjshir Valley, I guess, was a little bit isolated from a lot of the crazy that sort of been engulfing Afghanistan for the past 20 years. It's always been a little bit more of a safe haven, not to say that it still definitely has attacks and it's still very vulnerable to attacks, but it's managed to pretty well fortify itself from a lot of that and maintain this sort of very antiquated, rich feeling, I guess. And it's fascinating because when you walk through it, it still has all the remnants from the Soviet war. That was the place that was hit the hardest during that war. So you still have all the Soviet tanks, and they're just everywhere. They just kind of, nobody ever picked them up, and they still, the weapons are still on the ground, and it's a fascinating kind of live museum. Yeah, it's hard to explain.
How much time did you spend there?
In Panjshir itself, I think I was there for about a week.
Yeah.
And then sort of, Afghanistan in and out.
Yeah. What was the most materialistic thing that you missed from back home while you were over there that you're almost ashamed to admit?
Just a regular toilet. That was it, a regular toilet.
I don't know that I'd call a toilet a materialistic thing. But.
I don't know. I tell you, that was the one thing I realized I could just never get used to. No matter how long I was there, I could just never get used to the hole in the ground thing. Yeah. It just killed me every time.
Yeah, no, I hear you. It's a lot easier being a guy in that scenario for sure. But what is your ideal vacation?
Oh God, that's really mood dependent. How I feel when I wake up that morning. I've always been someone who really likes adventure vacations, so going to places and being sort of part of their history and trying to immerse myself in whatever the locals are doing and just kind of experiencing the local food and the local dining and the local things that there are to see. I think the more chaotic, though, that my work has been, the more that I've looked for places where I can do nothing.
Yeah.
Where you can lie on that pretty beach. And I'm Australian, so I'm a hot weather girl. I like the ocean, so...
Yeah. Do you find it hard to kind of turn your brain off that way? I know for me, vacation wise, like I don't really take them because I can't, and not that I can't make it happen. Of course, I could carve the time out and make it happen. For me, I'm so kind of integrated into my business and entrepreneurship from that standpoint that it's really difficult for me to just unplug and disconnect because there's just so many other things going on, which I know isn't particularly great. But do you find? Yeah,
I'm with you on that. In that, I guess I've rationalized if I'm not checking my emails, then I'm gonna have 1,000 piled up when I get back, and that's going to be more stressful anticipating that.
Yeah.
So I do try to still keep on top of things when I can.
Yeah.
I wish that I could learn to disconnect better. I think that's a healthy thing if we can do it, but I'm with you. I'm not there yet.
Yeah. I think there's a level of, I mean, I hate to say it in the world that we live in, but I think it's just kind of a stark reality that there's an amount of financial freedom that has to be there for you to be able to not worry about those things. Like, I mean, to me, for me, I guess, until I'm at that point, I can't switch it off. Like I'm still just always trying to get to a point where I don't have to worry about things. Maybe that never comes. I don't know. One of the things I ask every guest that I always find fascinating is, what is your morning routine? Now, for you, I'll caveat that with, and I do with most guests, but this is as normal of a routine when you're at home, if such a place even exists, a home base that you can really, kind of, I guess, explain what that looks like, not when you're traveling.
Yeah. I'm always traveling. So home to me isn't really a material structure. It's where I lay my head, or it's people that I'm around. So I'm pretty minimalist in that sense for now. But I'm a big proponent of running. I really love running, and it's a deal breaker for me wherever I am. So I try to avoid scheduling anything that's super early that might prevent me from doing my morning run. So that's usually the first thing I do once I sort of get up and pull myself together a little bit, and I'm kind of slow getting out the door. But it's the no-brainer. So the run is everything. It's usually 40, 45 minutes, 50 minutes. And then in my previous life, I was a ballet dancer, so I'm still very big on stretching and keeping the body healthy that way. So I stretch and then load up on coffee.
Do you eat anything first thing in the morning?
It depends again. I try not to. I try to give it a few hours until sort of maybe 11 or however where I am. But sometimes traveling, you kind of just got to eat something when you can if you don't know if you're going to have something later. So I try not to be too stringent about it, but I do like the idea of kind of just waiting a little bit and doing that sort of 14-hour fast if you can.
Yeah. So you mentioned you're from Australia. Tell me a little bit about kind of where specifically in Australia you're from and what your childhood was like.
So I grew up in North Queensland. Both my parents are from just north of Cairns, which is near the Great Barrier Reef. It's right at the top of the country. You've been there?
I've been there.
Oh, nice. Yep. It's a beautiful place. So that was sort of where much of my childhood was spent. My grandfather was a sugarcane farmer, so it was very remote, sort of tropical rainforest, very isolated place. And I think that's probably why I sort of learned to be a writer when I was pretty young, because that was the only thing that was going to entertain my brain. There wasn't too many people around me to keep me stimulated. So yeah, it was a gorgeous upbringing. And then my dad was in the mines, so we moved to New South Wales, to the Hunter Valley when I was young. And then I sort of became very committed to my dance and my ballet. So I went to boarding school quite young in Sydney. And it was sort of one of those fame schools. So everybody there was sort of in the arts. And it was a great time. I still say that was one of the best sort of few years of my life was my time at boarding school. And
I think a lot of kids maybe would resent that a little bit, but for you, was it because it was such a contrast from such an isolated earlier childhood, you think?
Yeah, I think so. And then, one of the biggest things that high school's obviously is a traumatic time. I think for a lot of people, it's a difficult time. And so I kind of come from a public high school that was and I had great friends, but it was very cliquey, and there was sort of a lot of social pressures in that way. And then suddenly I went to this school where everybody was so accepted for as weird and as wonderful as they were. And it was a really ahead of its time. It was called the McDonald College, and it was really ahead of its time in the way that it embraced so many people. And so you never had to deal with kind of the bullying stereotypes and the things that came from most high schools. And it was really an exceptional place. So it gave me a great sort of foundation in knowing how supportive people had the potential to be.
Yeah.
I really treasured that time.
What age did you go there?
I think I was 15.
And how old were you when you moved from the kind of in the sticks to down?
To New South Wales. I was, and that was a country town also, but I think I was about 9.
9.
Yeah.
So in that first 9 years, was it isolated to the point where, like, it was a farmhouse that was no neighbors anywhere near around, and it was just you, or did you have siblings?
So we moved around a little bit because of my dad's job, but we had neighbors in certain towns, and then for long stretches of time, we'd go to the sugarcane farm where there was no one around. There was literally, I don't even know that I would have seen people. We'd go into town, which is where my nana lived, in the small town. That was my dad's mom. And so I had cousins and people there. So they were my little bit more socializing, and then back out to the sugarcane farm where it was kind of like they just built a bridge. So if the river flooded, you couldn't even get over, and that's where my mother grew up. So, for her, it was when it flooded, you couldn't even go to school. So I appreciated the fact that they even just had a bridge.
Yeah.
But there were so many scary animals. My dad was always scared to let us out of his sight because, the crocs were in the river, and we had these things called stonefish. So if you went in the river, the stonefish, they look like stones, and you step on them and they can kill you.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Australia is notorious for being pretty much the most dangerous place in the world.
and that had everything. Yeah.
Were there any close calls with anything growing up?
No, we'd see snakes all the time. I remember waking up and there would be snakes that were on the roof. And, I had a friend that came over to the house one time and she got bit by a redback spider from one of my toys. I remember that was a big drama because if you don't get that anti-venom in the first 30 minutes, you're dead. Little things like that, but it was happening to everyone else, not me.
Yeah. Did you have any siblings?
I have a sister. She's 2 years older.
Yeah. How did you guys get along growing up?
We've always gotten along really great. We couldn't be more different in the lifestyles that we have and just personality wise and everything. But she is my absolute rock. She is, the person I text with every day, and she's just a beautiful support. And she's in Sydney and has her own family there. But she's just. Yeah, we couldn't be more different, but more alike.
Yeah. Was it that way growing up too? Even when you were young, you were real tight, or was it typical sister? Like one minute you're pulling each other's hair, and the next minute you're helping her out.
I think we definitely had our share of fights, but one thing I remember, my dad particularly was really always kind of his big thing was making sure that if we argued, we found a resolution and we made up, and he just never wanted to see us fight. And we pretty much got away with doing a lot of things when we were kids. But the thing that would get us into trouble was fighting between each other and coming home sunburned. Pretty much everything else was go do what you want. I was pretty lucky in that sense, but they were the two things
I get the fighting thing. What's the rub with sunburn?
I think it's just that Australian sun and just the amount of skin cancer, I think that's on both sides of my family. And so if I went out for the day and didn't wear my sunscreen and came back sunburned, I would be running to hide from my dad. I'd be stealing my mother's makeup or something. That was just his big thing. He was so anal about not getting sunburned.
Were they? It sounds like they weren't super strict then, other than those two things. Like, did they let you guys kind of?
Yeah, they did. It was funny, especially growing up as a teenager. I look back on it now, and my parents were pretty great about letting us go out and fail and come back and listening to us kind of complain. I don't know that I would be as free as they were in that sense, but maybe that's because I know all the tricks. But yeah, they were really great about just kind of enabling us to be adults fairly young, and I was working fairly young professionally with my ballet and dancing and doing commercial work and traveling a lot. So I guess I had to sort of grow up very fast and learn to manage things on my own and then moving away. So they were always a great support in that, but they definitely probably without knowing it fostered an extremely independent person.
Yeah. Well, that's a good thing for sure.
Yeah.
So speaking of which, I guess once you went to high school at the boarding school, at what point did you kind of realize or find out that this is what you wanted to do, or did that not happen then? Like, what was your mentality and train of thought in terms of what you wanted to do when you grow up, so to speak, at that age? Was it this? Was it something different? And kind of how did you go from being in boarding school for ballet and traveling to kind of the next phase?
Right. So I actually published a book when I was about 12, 13. It
Really?
was a sort of a teen fiction book. I can't even really tell you what it was about. But again, it was written in those long stretches of isolation. And so I published that. And I always just loved to write. That was something I loved, but never really saw it as something I was going to do as a profession. I loved to create. I loved the arts aspect of it. But I loved... I also just had a great fascination with culture and people, and I'd like to think a great compassion for what people were going through. And so I always wasn't quite sure how to make all those things fit. And so I guess my analogy was to hopefully go into something with my ballet or with choreography to do, especially while I was young and still sort of physically able. But I ended up falling and breaking my ankle when I was 18. So that kind of put a bit of a spanner in the works. And I went back to Sydney and started to study. Still wasn't even really quite sure what I wanted to do, but ended up kind of looking at filmmaking, looking at human rights law, and sort of really focusing on international relations. I ended up getting an opportunity to go and finish my degree in New York. And I was one of those people who just wanted to be out of school to get it done as quickly as I could. I just didn't have an interest in doing 1,000 degrees or kind of being stuck in that academia loophole. So I went to New York and thought, well, I can go and sort of study at Broadway Dance and Alvin Ailey and all these places, and then finish my degree at the same time and then kind of figure it out. And I ended up getting this internship at Fox, and I didn't even know what an internship was. It wasn't something we really have in Australia, and everybody was talking about it, and I thought, I want to be part of this too. So I applied for a bunch of different places online, and they called me and said, would you like to come in and work in the digital division? And at that point, that was in 2006. So .com was still, it wasn't the sort of the main focus of news sites. There was no Facebook or Twitter or anything like that. So that was kind of how I got my start. It was sort of random. And then, yeah, I fell in love. It was a chance for me to write. It was a chance for me to be in a newsroom in New York City and just get a real understanding for how this journalism thing worked. So at the end of that internship, they offered to sponsor me. And so it just seemed like an opportunity that you shouldn't turn down. So I took it.
What was that from a sponsorship standpoint? Like, what for the listener, what does that mean and entail?
So obviously, you hear a lot about the challenges that come with Americans or trying to get work in America and trying to get the right visas, and they can take a long time. And at the time that I got mine, I was very fortunate. There was a special agreement that George W. Bush had with the Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard, at the time. And that was for a sort of a special working visa between Australians and Americans, and it was called an E3 visa. And nobody really knew about it. It wasn't sort of heavily promoted, but as long as you had a bachelor's degree, then you could get this sponsorship in the US. So it actually was a pretty easy process for me in that sense. I just had to submit some paperwork and wait around a little bit and just kind of get that. And I think for the first 2 or 3 years, I would have to go and get it renewed. And then I ended up, getting my green card. And then I became a CIT in 2017.
Nice. When you were growing up, I'm curious, like what your perception of America was, and then how it contrasted from when you actually got here and experienced it.
So I made my first trip to America. I think I was 12 years old. So both my parents have always had an extreme love for the United States. So my mother's aunt, she was a war bride. So during the Second World War, when a lot of American soldiers went to the US, scores of them, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, found these Australian wives and brought them back. So there's actually this whole community in the US that they call war brides. And it's fascinating. So my aunt, she was 18, 19 at the time, meets this strapping American soldier and is pregnant on the boat coming back to the United States. So I had, I call her my aunt. She's my mother's cousin, but she was born here, and her and I are extremely close. So she lives in Northern California, and she's just the epitome of your 1970s flower child who grew up in Oakland and still a hippie on the pot farm in California. So I always had this sort of different love and appreciation for America. And then my dad always just kind of loved America and looked at it as being, Australia's protector in some way, I think, because he saw that if anything had ever happened, and Australia's never had a war on its soil, but if anything ever happened, Australia, probably doesn't have the defense capabilities to necessarily be able to protect the entire country. So he always looked at it as America being a kind of an important protector.
Yeah. And then, so once you actually moved here, I know, you came here at 12, but when you actually moved to New York and spent some time integrated into the society as an adult, what was your impression of the States at that point?
So I think in the beginning, it was interesting for me because one of the things I noticed was how much more PC the US was compared to Australia. And that was just, everything was very literal, whereas Australia just tend to be a little bit more maybe laid back, and you can kind of crack a joke and not feel that you're going to offend anybody. And we kind of insult each other as a token of love. Yeah. So that was sort of a bit of a culture shock for me in the beginning. I had to kind of learn that I had to be pretty careful about what I said and did. So that was one of the biggest things that I really found in that sense. And, back then too, it was interesting to me because this was 2006. America was still in many ways still is, but back then politically was so puritanical on both sides. It's sort of, you had to have the wife and the kids and everything had to sort of line up in this cookie cutter way. And that was different for me too, because, Australia just, I don't even think we really knew who people were married to when they were running for office, or what their kids were, or where they went to school. And so anyway, it was just a different sort of sensibility. It's obviously changed a lot since then, but back then it was still, pretty formulaic.
Would you say that there's still that disparity in Australia in contrast to the United States in terms of being more PC, or is Australia caught up?
I think Australia's if it hasn't caught up, it's definitely catching up. Yeah, is my understanding of it.
Yeah, to me it breaks my heart to hear that, because the last time I was in Australia was 99, 2000, and it was great. Plus, we were up in Darwin and up in the Northern Territory, and the reason that I ended up in I know you guys pronounce it Cairns, which it's spelled Cairns, but you know, I guess that's the accent difference. But so nobody knew what the hell we were talking about when we were like, we're trying to get to Cairns. They're like, it's not called Cairns. But anyway, we flew. We lied to our officer in charge, and there was just a small handful of us that said that we were going to go to Litchfield National Park and camp for the weekend. Now, mind you, like we're in a SEAL platoon. We're at Darwin. We're working with the North Force guys. We're there for like 5 weeks. And we have 1 3-day weekend off, and so you know we tell him that we're going to Litchfield National Park, and we hop on a Qantas airplane and fly all the way to the Gold Coast, and did like bar hopping.
You partied at Surfers Paradise?
Probably, I don't even remember. It was all a blur. It was all
good old Goldie, it's the best place.
Yeah, but we did dive on the Great Barrier Reef and hung out for a few days and made it back without incident. But that was my experience with it.
Yeah.
But back then, I guess my point is that my appreciation for the culture, especially up in the north that way, was like, this place is awesome. Like nobody gave two shits about anything. You know, everybody was really open, and there was just a very refreshing relaxedness about the way people interacted with each other and even us as American soldiers and whatever. It was really cool. You know, really fun memory.
Real salt of the earth people.
Yeah. All right, so you get sponsored, and at that point, professionally, where did you go from there as they took you on board and kind of under their wing, so to speak?
So they wanted to build up a presence in Los Angeles, and so I went. I was happy to go wherever. I mean, I was so in love with New York at that time. You know, it was just this such a big, dazzling place compared to the country's towns that I'd sort of grown up in. So I was really in love with New York, and it broke my heart. I didn't want to go to LA, but I was willing to go wherever I needed to go for work. So I came to Los Angeles. It was the summer of 2007. Found a nice little place near the beach and kind of, pretty much baptism by fire, fell into a life. And I had a column and I knew nobody and was basically told, you need to go out and find stories. And so that's what I did.
So it was all just local stuff?
No, it was national, but it was, I had to go out and build sources. And it was really from the ground up, and it was the best training because it was pre sort of Twitter. I know so much news is gathered now and social media, but so much of what I learned to do was that one-on-one interaction. And I learned what it took to build a relationship with somebody, to understand what it meant to, craft an interview and to put a story together and to write it and sort of all these elements. And I had nobody that was kind of backing me other than I just had to go out and do it. And a lot of it was, it was sort of a broad range of things. So I did, a lot of court reporting, and I started doing an investigative stuff. But with that, being in LA, I had to do a lot of entertainment. And again, I was 20, 21. And so it was fascinating to me because it was such a great training ground because I really learned to smell bullshit really early. And there is so much bullshit in that world. But you meet great people too, and you sort of learn to navigate the teams that come around people. So a celebrity that's sort of layered with, their publicists and their managers, and there's this, and everybody's trying to spin things the other way. And I think I really had to just navigate, well, what is the sort of the truth behind this? So it was a really fascinating kind of odd start into war reporting.
Well, yeah, I mean, I imagine that I can understand, where you're coming from and what you mean by that, and that if you can get through all of that, which the whole kind of point of it is a facade over a facade, kind of thing. Where I can see where there's probably not, in terms of keeping you safe while you're learning, a better training ground for sifting through everything and getting to the root of whatever issue it is that you're talking about. I mean, that actually, it seems like that'd be the best place to send anybody to learn, right? I mean,
yeah, totally. And as long as you're not trying to be, and which I, don't think I ever was, I think the kiss of death people make in that industry, or in any journalism industry really, is trying to be friends with the subjects.
Yeah.
So for me, that wasn't. Of course, I met great people, and I still have a few good people that I like from that world, but I was never trying to be a friend. I was never the starstruck person, and I think that's what makes you, better or more efficient at your job than people that are kind of trying to kiss your ass, basically.
I think that's the biggest problem with political journalism now is
Sure.
that's what happens is that, on both sides, admittedly, but is that you've got, journalists who are interviewing people that they like and they want to promote their agenda and they throw them fucking softballs. And I think most people can see right through that. I think the left is historically terrible about that because there's so much of the media is such a heavy left bias. Did you find any of your personal politics interfering at all, or manipulating some of your line of questioning, or did you ever find yourself having to keep yourself in check, or was it really easy to compartmentalize that?
I think for me, again, that was a real training ground. I remember as an intern in New York City at Fox, and I remember Roger Ailes speaking to us as interns, and one of the big things that he instilled at that time was, you are going to present both sides of the story. And so from my very beginning, the emphasis was always on, you are always going to be balanced. What you say doesn't matter. I remember, a coworker asking me at the time what my politics were, and I said it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter. And if we're having a professional conversation, it doesn't matter. So that was always that was the values that were instilled in me from a very young age. So I don't think I struggled with that, because everything I looked at, I tried to look at it from the lens of this, and that's one thing I tried to do in the book, that is the lens of how everybody's thinking without judgment. I think the media landscape has changed, so I think that now people are looking to go extreme one way or another, and the balance doesn't matter because that's the business model that makes money. And I think that's unfortunate, because that's not what journalism has historically been and shouldn't be.
So that's probably the answer to my follow-up question is that beyond that, I guess, is there any reason that you can think of beyond the money and the ratings as to why it's so skewed that way now? Is there anything else that's driving that? Because to me, I agree, it's heartbreaking, and I find it to be a bit of a travesty to turn on any news outlet, really, and within seconds you can see right through what they're trying to quote unquote report, and it's not reporting. Like it's them spinning a certain agenda, and then they're trying to get you to buy it.
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's just business model. It comes down to mobilizing an audience. So it's coming down to, if you have a niche and you can capitalize on a specific audience rather than trying to galvanize an entire population, people just aren't interested in sort of the dry, balanced reporting that
the Walter Cronkite, here's what actually happened. People
just aren't interested in that.
Yeah.
And to sort of to carve out the niche, and everything is about a branding and a niche, and in today's climate, you've got to kind of pick a side.
What do you see in terms of what the future holds as far as that goes? I mean, do you think that there can be a full circle correction, or do you see it just getting worse and worse? To me, there has to be a breaking point where, and I don't know what that is, but I'm curious, you being in that business, like, where do you see it going, and is there a fix?
I think it's going to end up becoming so oversaturated on both sides of the sort of, with everybody competing with everybody else for that same audience share, that I think the noise will blow over itself. And the social media obviously drives a lot of that too. But I do think that there has to be a breaking point. I don't know how or when we'll get there, and even if it'll be anytime soon. But I do just see sort of that saturation point happening. But one thing I do think is been super great development I've observed over the past year is a lot of the great, more individual journalists that are really, I guess, free thinking and fairly independent in their thoughts and not wanting to be part of that landscape, are all kind of moving to things like Substack. And I think that's great for journalism too, for journalists to be able to take back control of how they want their narrative presented and to make money in that process. We're a capitalist society, and be able to present their opinions or the news without sort of the biases from above. So I really hope that a lot more of those independent movements will continue to happen as well.
Yeah, no, me too. And I hope that that the people can keep up. I hope that you're right. Oversaturation wise, I know for me personally, like it got to a point, even pre-election where I was just like, you know what, I'm not even going to I just can't listen to any more of it, and I hope and I think that a lot of people are kind of in that same boat where they're just so over inundated with it that they're just like, fuck this, I'm not even going to listen to it. And they just turn it off. And at some point, if enough people do that, they're going to change because they have to, or they go out of business, but
yeah. And it's a shame because we want to, we all want to be as informed as we can about life, and we want an informed society, but I agree. It does become too much. And then when it impacts how you feel, your health or whatever it is, then it's like, fuck it, turn it off.
Yeah. How many years did you spend out in LA doing the?
So I was sort of traveling in and out of LA, but I guess I lived there from 2007. Oh my gosh, almost 10 years. And I moved back to New York in the beginning of 2017.
Okay. Yeah. So from that time, at what point did it shift from the national U.S. stories and kind of Hollywood elites to War Correspondent stuff? Walk us through that transition.
So it was sort of over time. I guess the Arab Spring started, 10 years now. So that was sort of a big thing that I really engaged a lot with the Middle East on. I'd sort of taken a few language classes and traveled a bit when I was younger to the area, and I had a basic working knowledge of Arabic. So I really started to engage with people there, and I was just deeply curious as to what was going on and how this whole thing would sort of play out. So I began traveling to the region around that time and covering different things. And then I guess my real sort of foray into it was 2013 with Syria war, and then 2014 when the ISIS onslaught happened in Iraq. And that was sort of when I really dove headfirst into that. And it became all consuming, and that was sort of then my focus for much of the next 4 or 5 years, was trying to understand how it had happened.
Yeah. Was there kind of an initiation, if you will, of like boots on the ground in a place where you were kind of looking around like, holy shit, how did I get myself into this? Was there like a one moment where that happened, or was it kind of gradual getting your feet wet?
It was fairly baptism by fire, and I'm lucky in the sense that I had I had great bosses at the time who were very supportive of me going out and doing it. And I had a great mentor who was a foreign correspondent at Fox by the name of Dominique, and he'd just come back from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and he just sort of said to me, the only way you do it is you do it. And I know that can sort of sound daunting and reckless in some ways to people, but it's really the truth. Have a basic medical knowledge, know what you're getting into, understand what you're doing, and at some point you've got to start somewhere with it. So I think my first sort of real coverage of these was probably the Gaza war in 2014, and that was baptism by fire. I was sort of in the area, and so I would sort of cover kind of, I guess, the best of my abilities on both sides of that conflict, which is obviously supercharged, and people on both sides feeling very frustrated with what was happening. And that was the summer of 2014, and then from there I went to Iraq after that. So
to compare Gaza to Iraq, how would you kind of rate both places in terms of your feeling of safety when you're on the ground?
I think obviously the Gaza war is a lot more urban in the sense it's everything sort of happening all at once and within a small kind of proximity. I don't think that I was ever super afraid in those situations. I think that maybe that's when I realized that it was it was a profession that I thought that I could do, because I was always calm in places where other people were panicking. So I didn't feel a huge sense of fear in that. And then I guess even with Iraq, it was the same situation. There were obviously moments of fear, but I think if I was to look at my career more holistically, I was always less afraid of, say, a terrorist group or those kind of things than I was of a government that can come and snatch you up at any moment, or that was that things that you can't see and the things that you don't know, and usually not even in a conflict zone, were the things that exhausted me from worry.
Yeah. So when you're there in each capacity or no matter where you're at, what does your crew look like? How many of there are?
My crew is me, and I. So yeah, obviously as a writer, I'm not going in with cameraman or crews.
No security.
I made a decision very young in my early days, I guess I should say, my career, where I felt that it was better for me to not only to get the story, but also from a security point of view to be as under the radar as possible. And because so much of what I wanted to do was sort of that more undercover style of things. And I definitely couldn't have done that if there were, a bunch of sort of people around me. And I think that would have made me more of a target, because at that point, ISIS was kidnapping journalists and journalists were the target. So I think that would have been a dangerous move. So I decided that the approach I wanted to take was very under the radar. I'd built up some really great relationships. I trusted a lot of people. I have what we call fixers. So fixers are people that you, locals usually come through referrals, you pay them, they sort of set up logistics and they set up drivers for you and they set up interviews and they sort of support you in that way. And so I've always been really fortunate to have amazing fixers that I've just developed these really close bonds with over time. And so depending on the trip, in Syria and other places, it's usually just me and my fixer and then, his friend who's the driver.
So with the fixer thing, I'm curious, like logistically, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners are that are outside of this world, myself included. Obviously, like, you're not just showing up and being like, hey, I'm Hollie, I'm here to do some story report. Like, how do you line that up?
There's a huge amount of planning that goes into it.
And who does that, I guess?
That was all on me. I was literally planning everything from A to B, so that I didn't have help in that. So, it was always harder when you're going into a new place too, because then you have to try to reestablish new connections and call on people who you know are from people and sort of work it that way. But yeah, you generally seek a recommendation for a fixer. So for example, I'm going to Baghdad. Who do I know is there? Who's worked there before? I may ask other journalists. I may ask people in the humanitarian sector. I'll talk to locals on the ground and say, do you know anyone who does this kind of work? And so that's usually how it works. And then you kind of just have to trust and do as much vetting on that person as you can. I mean, it's hard in that part of the world to really vet. So you just have to kind of trust the referrals and where they're coming from and speak to them and just hope that they're going to have your best interests and you aren't going to be sold out. And that has definitely happened to journalists and other people. Fortunately, never to me, but it happens. But fixers are extraordinary, and we wouldn't be able to do our jobs without them. And they risk their lives to tell the story, to support you, to often in the face of a lot of hostility. And for me, I've always felt a very deep connection to a lot of my fixers, because you see firsthand what they're willing to sacrifice for someone that they don't even know. And you meet their families and you know that you have the privilege of leaving. I have the privilege of going home and getting out. Whereas, for them, they have to stay. And if somebody finds out that they were working for an American, or, their lives, their family's lives, everything they've ever had is at risk. So I think fixers are such extraordinary parts of the story, and they don't get credit in the stories, because that would also be unsafe for them to have credit in a story. But they're doing so much of the work in trying to support you and get you the right interviews and help you bridge those connections.
Are they typically paid?
Yes.
And yeah. I don't know if you can mention or want to.
It really depends where you are and I guess how in demand that particular fixer is. But in Iraq, in a place like that, you're probably looking at you're paying someone maybe $200, $300 a day, which is a lot for them. And so that, the work is really sought after by them, because that is a lot for them. But, in the grand scheme of what they're sacrificing for it, it seems very little.
I'm assuming Fox pays that, right? Like if you're
So
negotiating.
yeah, I mean, if you're depending on, where your story is, and it's different for each news outlet, and it's different obviously if you're freelancing. I've also done a lot of the writing projects where I've paid out of pocket because things have changed last minute, and when you're dealing with corporate stuff, it's sometimes easier just to pay out of pocket. So, but I have no qualms about doing that with my fixes because I've always found them to be such really extraordinary people.
Yeah. As far as still talking about kind of logistics, I'm fascinated by, and just because I just know nothing about it, but like would Fox or whoever you're working for at that point, provided you're not freelance, independent, whatever, would they say, hey, we want you to go here or find a place to go. You have a budget of X number of dollars in this amount of time. Is that kind of? So
usually how I used to work it, and I had a great relationship with my previous boss in that sense, who had worked a lot in the foreign space as well. So I would sort of pitch an idea of I wanted to go here to cover X, Y, Z, and sort of pitch, usually a bunch of stories, and maybe 2 or 3 would get approved. And then, of course, when I was there, I'd do a bunch of other ones as well. But I usually went in with a sort of a base idea of what it was that I was trying to cover while I was there, because that enabled me to then sort of look for the right connections, look for the right aid groups, look for the right interview subjects, whatever it may be. So I did have some structure, and I wasn't just kind of going in and going in cold. So I had an idea, and then it would just come down to, I usually sort of put together some sort of a budget. Okay, this is the flight, this is the hotel, this is where I'm going to stay, and basically this is how much this fixer costs. And so there's a lot of even just kind of planning, and then a lot of the time it can go nowhere. But once I guess that green light from the sort of basic outline, and I then was sort of able to then have to really hone in on how to make everything happen. And I think the hardest thing for me sometimes was trying to translate to people back home. If I was on the ground there, okay, just because somebody told me that I could cross the Euphrates on a boat and go to Syria on Wednesday, I may get all the way there, and then they've gone for the day to take a nap, and they're not coming back until Saturday. So, so it's always explaining, like, I'm on Middle East time right now. Yeah. I can't change the situation. You can only be patient with it. And so I think that was always, a little bit of a contention. I was like, you just need to bear with me.
The God-willing approach to everything. Yes. Yeah. I'm curious, and I'm sure it changes just like, or it varies rather from trip to trip, but if you're by yourself and you're relatively mobile, you're kind of bouncing all over the place, what do you pack and how do you carry it?
I take as little as possible.
Yeah, which makes sense. But so, I mean, is everything in a backpack or? Pretty
much. So everything's in a backpack. I used to sort of take my armor and take stuff, as journalists, you buy your own generally. So I used to, but I just found that to be so laborious and so many problems at the airport with that stuff. Yeah. What is this for? What are you doing? Yeah. So I just usually, especially with Iraq, I made some good sort of connections there with some contractors and other friends and things on the ground. So I usually just sort of arranged to pick something up if I needed it from them instead. Yeah. And the same with Afghanistan. So that made my life a lot easier, because then I could just kind of go in with my backpack, usually carried a couple of different iPhones, and then bought a burner phone when I was there. And then, just a pair of boots, a pair of pants, a t-shirt. You're a buyer in case you went to the south or somewhere that was much more conservative. And then a bunch of notebooks, and that was kind of pretty much it.
So literally like one pair of pants, one t-shirt.
Yeah. And then I still always tried to find time to work out when I was there too, running up and down a street or something, whatever it was. So my workout stuff too.
Yeah. All in one backpack, like a toiletry bag. And any special items that you take, or you try to keep the personal stuff?
I tried to keep everything as minimalist as possible, and tried to just figure it out that I had to adapt with whatever the situation was when I was there, and go with the flow.
Any accommodations made in terms of the like from a technology standpoint? all notebooks, or did you carry iPads, like any electronic, or was it all pen and paper?
I usually didn't even take a laptop, and
Yeah.
that was more from a security point of view because they're so much easier to break into than your phone or other things. And so it was just kind of one less stress for me. So back then I would be filing entire stories on a phone,
Wow.
in the BlackBerry in the beginning, which was way easier to type. So I'd file from my BlackBerry and then later on an iPhone. And that was always just the way I did it because it felt that I could do that from anywhere. And that I could get, if I had the cell data, I could get a connection somewhere. Whereas laptop, you sort of, you're relying on Wi-Fi, which is sketchy at best. And it was just the way to do it. And I could, I had a folder, sort of like a Dropbox, but a little bit larger. And I just try to dump as many photos and videos into that shared folder so that anyone on the other end could access it before anything was deleted.
Yeah.
So that was the other thing you also had to be watchful about was, you never know when you're going to go through an airport and someone's going to want to delete your content. So
did you have that happen?
I had one situation where they did delete some stuff, but they weren't very smart about it because they thought, they made me they watched me delete stuff.
But not empty your trash.
And then not empty my trash. So, yeah.
I know you know that one.
Yeah. So that was sort of my only, but again, I wasn't carrying cards or USBs or anything like that. So I was pretty fortunate like that. But yeah, I did just try to put it in that folder and dump it out when I could so that it didn't cause me any problems.
Yeah. Did you ever carry like a pocket knife or any type of weapon or self-defense, anything?
No, because, well, yeah. I mean, it's sort of that carrying a gun, first of all, as a journalist is a no-no because you're then considered a combatant. And the idea, going back to the Geneva Convention, is that a journalist is a neutral observer to a situation. And I've always tried to really maintain that. I know some journalists have armed themselves, and I just think that can potentially endanger other journalists as well, because even though, yes, we are targets, then we're also viewed as sort of being a combatant. So yeah, I usually try to not take anything like that. And obviously, I think a knife is probably okay, but I didn't do that because, again, I just wanted to maintain that complete sense of neutrality where I could.
Yeah. Did you ever have any close calls as far as, people, whether it's governments or ISIS fighters or really any situation you were at where it was literally like could have gone either way and you just barely got out of it type of thing?
Yeah, I think for me, some of those kind of more I mean, there was definitely a couple of situations in Iraq where the building I was in Sinjar was being shelled, and yeah, several of the sort of the Peshmerga soldiers that were at the front died. And I guess I never felt, definitely not invincible, but I never felt that sense of that it was fear that it was going to get me, I guess. And that's maybe naive or maybe not the right way to view a situation. But I think even in some of those hair-raising situations, I felt what I think is a healthy sense of fear, but I never felt panic, or I never felt that it was going to be directed at me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a recurring theme
Yeah.
with that in terms of your ability to, like you mentioned earlier, stay calm when everybody else is panicking. Do you think that growing up in rural farmland Australia with so many exterior threats, animal-wise, like where do you think that comes from? Because very few people possess that, especially just naturally.
Right. I think for me, part of it was acceptance that I'd made a decision to go into that situation and that nobody told me I had to do it. Nobody had forced me to. And I think I was in awe of the people that lived there, that dealt with it day in and day out, and they didn't complain, and that was their life. They couldn't leave. And so I thought very early on, for me to complain or for me to, cause a drama about something, that would be that would just be sort of a shameful thing, given that the people there, this is their life.
Yeah.
And who was I to kind of go in there and I guess see myself as more important than them. And so I always viewed it with a sense of acceptance that this was a decision that I'd made to be there. And I think it's a lot harder for people, your friends and your family and people who love you, to understand that. They think it's crazy. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? You don't need to do this. You need to stop doing this. But when it's you, you make the decision and you do it. And I still feel that everything always looks more frightening from the outside, in a way. And as frightening as situations can be, even inside the situation, even when chaos is happening, there is that sort of sense of calm and rational thinking of how am I going to get in and out of this, that I try to possess. But again, I always found that my anxieties were triggered by things I didn't know. So, in Syria, I remember being there, and I'd been there for less than 24 hours. And then that's when Trump launched, I think it was the second round of fighter jets to kind of take out those chemical compounds after another chemical attack. And so there was a lot of sort of chaos and unknowns. And I remember I then started to get strange calls on my phone and people hanging up. And, whether it was or it wasn't, I don't know. But immediately my mind went to, this is the Mukhabarat. This is the Syrian intelligence. They know I'm in here, illegally, essentially. And they're going to find me. And, Trump was doing this. And that triggered a little bit of a panic for me, because then it was this exhaustion of unknown. And everywhere I sort of went, I was waiting for the cracked leather jacket and the aviator to come my way and knock on the door. And so that was sort of an anxiety that was where I found that my kind of anxieties were triggered more by that. And I went to Iran as well. And again, that was just exhausting. And it was this beautiful country and beautiful people and beautiful place. But the entire time you just have this sort of fear of, could there be a knock at the door? And, am I going to spend the next 10 years in Evin prison? And that was where my, I guess, neurosis more came out.
Yeah. But I mean, I can appreciate and certainly understand your viewpoint on being far less worried about some rogue terrorist group and much more worried about a government coming and imprisoning you for being a spy or, whatever trumped up, made up charge. To me, Iran would be a terrifying place in that regard, for any American citizen, because you're just so much on their home turf and in their stadium, so to speak, that would be hard to relax ever there, I think. How much time did you spend there? So
I went there, actually, I was very clever. I did it just the week before I became a citizen. So I knew this was my last chance to go and visit Iran. And I was, it was one of those, always a fascinating place. It's this mysterious place and so I went in the summer of 2017. And for weeks leading up to it, I was really nervous because I was going alone. And, so I went and on my Aussie passport, and I arrived I got a visa code issued from a tourist agency or something sent to me. So I had this tourist code and I landed in Tehran. It was a Friday night, and everybody's getting their visas, like visa stamps in the back rooms, and except for me. So I can hear people going through, and I can hear them arguing. And then the guy sort of comes back out and starts asking me questions about where I worked and what I did. And I never want to lie. So I was honest, but semantics. I'm a writer, and I work for 21st Century Fox. I'm here as a tourist, And I can hear them continuing to argue. And I had all these stamps in my passport from Yemen to, Afghanistan, Pakistan, wherever it was. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's going to look at these stamps and they're going to think, who is this girl and what is she doing? But I actually think the stamps probably worked in my favor, because they probably looked at it and thought, oh, well, she just likes to travel to strange places. So they gave me my visa, and I ran through the airport before anyone could change their mind. And it was strange because, again, I was sort of alone, and I met up with a really lovely tour guide and a couple of British girls. And it was interesting because we traveled, we went around and saw a lot of the sort of the sites, and Iran is just a stunning country. And we went further north to Yazd and Isfahan and to the Zoroastrian temples there, and then Persepolis, like all these just incredible places. I'm a big lover of Persian poetry, so I took this 16-hour ride on one of those Shah-era trains that takes forever to the top of the country just to collect the Hafez poetry from his hometown. So I had a beautiful experience, but I was extremely nervous. And it was funny because I was allowed to sort of change my itinerary because Australians could kind of do anything, whereas the British girls that I ended up meeting, Canadians, Americans, and Brits are not even allowed to step out of the hotel without a minder. Yeah, so it's different set of rules, I guess. But I had a great time, and then I was relieved to leave. So I was there for about 2 weeks, and then I was really relieved to leave. And I noticed when I got on the plane that my seat that I checked in on wasn't the seat that I'd been assigned on my boarding pass, but I didn't argue it. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. And this lovely guy is sitting next to me, and he starts asking me all these questions immediately. Where, what were you doing? Who were you seeing? Da da da. And I was just sort of playing Aussie backpacker.
Is he speaking in Persian or English?
In English, perfect English. And then I started asking him questions. What are you doing in Dubai? And he couldn't really answer them. And I got sick of his questions, so I put my headset in and just kind of tuned out and slept for the rest of the trip. And then woke up when we landed, and he says to me, well, it was lovely to meet you, Hollie. And I looked back and I said, well, Ali, it was lovely to meet you too, and I never told you my name.
Yeah,
and just walked off. So they caught up to me eventually, I guess.
But so that was from Tehran to Dubai, that flight?
Yes.
So I mean, at that point, he couldn't have done it.
No, nothing. That's nothing. I think it was just the check-in. But Iran was just, I'm so glad I went there. Hopefully at some point in time, I'll get to go again, because it really just it's a stunning place.
Yeah. Do you speak Persian also?
No, I don't.
I mean, you speak a fair bit of Arabic, though, right?
Yeah, I've lost a lot. I need to be better about getting prepped back on that. But.
Yeah. Hearing of the airplane trip and just being there, Brits, Canadians, and Americans not being able to step outside their hotel without you called it a minder.
They have to have sort of the way the government,
chaperone kind of thing.
The government sort of assigns, people go through a course in Iran to kind of become these tour guides where they have to go through a sort of a government mandated course of learning, I guess, the history, and then they have to file reports back and all that kind of stuff.
Did you ever find in all of your travels, staying at lots of different hotels, I'm assuming of all different types of magnitudes in terms of the opulence or not, to where like you came back and your shit had been gone through, like it was obvious that people had been in your rooms?
I had one, and that was one of the early situations and that's when I stopped taking my laptop. And that was in Baghdad, I want to say. And that was when I had my laptop, and, I'd put as much security stuff on there as I can. And I did come back and see that somebody, someone had been trying to get into it and use a different password, and they left their name in the server thing. So it was pretty terrible. But after that, I was just like, all right, this is a joke.
That's a professional job there.
Yeah. But I always, obviously carried my essentials with me, and there's pretty little to go through, but I didn't think I noticed anything too much after that.
Yeah. And going through your book, obviously it would take, 2 days to outline all the things that are worth talking in there, which obviously we don't have time for. So I thought maybe a better way, instead of pulling tons of excerpts like I normally do, because to me in going through it, it was almost like the whole book is excerpts that are kind of worth reading, and some incredibly powerful scenarios that you've been witness to. I would love if you could kind of chronologically, as best you can, from a kind of a Reader's Digest shortened version, walk us through, from the start of when you really started covering ISIS heavy until you finally left, if you can.
So my book trajectory started with just going over there, and I was just taking interviews, taking notes, and all these notebooks were piling up. And this was starting in 2014. So the book that I ended up putting together was really I guess it's those raw notes put together, and they're put together in a chronological order. So we're dating from 2014 through to the end of 2018. And it's really just trying to tell the story from a micro level, in the sense that I really believe human stories and trying to understand what people on the ground are going through and the things that they're telling you, and that macro picture can tell a really macro, give people a macro understanding of what this war is and what is happening and how it's come to be. So I think through those individual excerpts, which I call memos, and they're all told from people from every different perspective that I could find. So you're looking at, Iraqi, Kurdish, Syrian, American military perspectives, as well as Yazidis that have been taken as sex slaves, as well as refugees, displaced people, the terrorists themselves. I interviewed a number of them, terrorist wives. So I'm really just trying to piece together how people view this situation and what happens, and kind of pull out some of those details and those really human stories that I think get really overlooked in a very sanitized news format. And so to me, that is what I really tried to do with the book, was highlight what is everyday like when you're dealing with this. When you have to leave your home, what do you take with you? What do you tell your children about why you are leaving? How do you explain, why your religion is targeted? How do you come back and try to reintegrate into society when, you've spent 3 years as a sex slave? Or how, what services are available to people? What are the international community doing? What is the military planning behind this? Why is one city being liberated when another city 20 miles no one's even looking at? So I just tried to kind of understand a lot of the burning questions I think can help us paint a broad picture of a situation without sort of copious sort of statistics, which I think, again, sanitize the situation and remove us from what's happening. Whereas when you can give a name and a face and explain where this person grew up and who they are and what they're going through, I think there's things from that we can all learn and we can all resonate with.
Was there situations there that really shocked you, or was it kind of you got numb to seeing a lot of the things that you see? Because, reading about, especially the way you talk about the smell of burning death, and how that there's a distinct flavor to that you always recognize and never forget, or people with all of their hair burned off, situations like that I think a lot of people, and again, I encourage everybody to read this book to really give you perspective outside of such a sheltered life that we live here, and probably hopefully give people a massive appreciation for the country that we live in, because so few people have it, because they are so sheltered from stuff like this. But were there instances where you found yourself, even after years in, where you were like, holy shit, or did you just get used to it and become kind of completely numb, and that it was just normal?
I think there's definitely two parts. So I've always said to myself in starting this that if I ever got to a place where I felt that I wasn't having a normal emotional reaction to something, then I needed to take a break, or I needed to stop. And that was always the thing for me, especially as a writer. I know this is the idea where journalists have to be super professional and super this, but if you're sitting with a mother who's just had her babies killed or whatever it is, and that's not going to upset you, I don't want to get to that place where something like that isn't going to affect me. I do think when you're immersed in it, and day in and day out and day in, and each story you hear gets worse than the next story, I don't know at that point that I became numb to it, but I think that it just started to feel very hopeless. Like, what am I doing? What is this? How much more can I take in? And during the Iraq trips, it was almost some of the moments that you don't necessarily expect to break you in a way that do. So, for example, I talk about in the book, but digging up mass graves or things like that by sort of standard definitions, people think that they're going to have the most impact on you. But I actually found for me, the things that really stuck with me weren't necessarily those things. It were some of the smaller things. Like I remember being in Sinjar City one time, and this city was not livable. It was absolutely, apocalyptic wasteland. And the only people that were living there were a few soldiers who'd sort of taken over a base there and were kind of using that as a makeshift hospital. And I stayed there for a while with them on the roof, and you couldn't even walk across the street because it was filled with landmines. And I went and somehow found this man that had moved back into his old house that was bombed because he couldn't afford to continue to stay at these displaced camps. And he had 2 young children. And I remember, there was no water, there was no electricity, there was nothing, and it was freezing. And I went to talk to him to find out, why he'd come back and why he didn't stay at the camp. And he told me that his wife and the children's mother, they were Yazidi, and that she'd been taken as a sex slave. And, one of the ISIS fighters or captors who had her had called him at some point and said, you can pay me $10,000 and I'll give her back to you. And this poor farmer, this illiterate farmer, and he walked around his village and he begged and pleaded, and people really come together in times like that. And so everybody's, selling whatever they could to get any of the girls back, mind you. And we're talking thousands and thousands of them. But in his case, it's, everybody scrambled together, and it took him months. And eventually he scrambles together the money, and he calls the captor back and says, I have the money. And the guy says, oh, well, the price is doubled now. And he just knew that there was nothing more he could do to bring his wife and his children's mother home. And he's telling me this, and I just broke down because I thought, I can't even help you. I can't recommend an NGO that can help you. I can't give you any money out of my pocket. I can't really do anything because that would be considered funding terrorism. And I just felt extremely helpless, I think, in that situation. And that really was a defining moment for me, because I thought, really, all I can do is tell your story. But then what is the point of your story if nobody can really help you? And so that was something that I had to toy with a lot, and I still toy with a lot. So yeah, moments like that for me were quite defining. I think I did get to a point maybe later in my career working in Africa, and where I started to feel numb to stories that I should have had a better reaction to, and I did take a break from those. But yeah, I just think more than the numbness, it was the helplessness that impacted me.
So in that, did that change your ability to report, or I guess maybe how you reported? I mean, because to me, if to see something like that right there in front of you and realize the gravity of what he's going through and the situation that you are in, I can't help but imagine that has to play a role in impacting how you're reporting, mm-hmm. Because if you go from optimist and reporting because you feel like you're making a difference to where you're like, fuck, it doesn't matter what I do, nothing is going to change. I mean, that can't not impact how you report, right? Or
right.
Did you?
No, I think it made me. There was a frustration element. I think once I'd gotten myself through the frustration element of kind of wanting to just give up on it to some degree, I reconciled with myself that he was telling me his story because he wanted his story to be heard. And to them, that's a sense of justice.
Yeah.
And so these are people who will never see justice for what's happened to them. They will never see accountability. No one will ever have to pay a price, and everyone else's lives will move on. But if their story can be told and reach somebody, that, however significant that may seem, is important to them. And they wouldn't have told me their story if they didn't think that was a sense of justice, to know that at least their wrongs weren't being hidden from the world. And I think that's the biggest thing for people, is everybody feels that they're suffering in silence, and that can be the most frustrating aspect of it. And people want to be heard.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me think of again, here in the United States, where 99% of the population just has the blind understanding that if they're wronged, really in any way, even like, hey, the McDonald's got my fucking drive-through order wrong, that they can call the police and something will happen.
Right. Or post it on Twitter now, or tag the airline when the seat's wrong. Or,
You know, and to me, it's just it's another sobering reminder. Not that I needed any, but they're always good. You know, to hear, and that things like that. It's just like it just, to me, it's what gives me heartburn about kind of the media situation, and just our culture here is how big of a contrast there is, and how blind people are to how most of the rest of the world is, or a large portion of it, you know. And again, just that understanding, or not even understanding, I would say that a sense of entitlement, that if something happens to me, I call a number and it gets fixed right fucking now.
Yeah.
You know, and that's just how it works, and I deserve that, you know. Whereas in so many other places, like, I mean, for any family to imagine a scenario where a group of masked gunmen come to your house, kick your door in, take your mom, take your children, shoot your dad, burn your fucking house down, and nothing happens. You know, like that's a harsh reality in so many places.
Totally. And that's what I used to explain to people when they come back. Imagine living in a place, you know, as flawed as the US may be, as difficult as, you know, as imperfect as it may be. We have hospitals we can go to when we you know, need to. We have police and 911 we can call when we're in desperate help. We have a justice system that enables, you know, to the best of its, and again, it's flawed, but it exists. And these people just have none of those institutions. They have nothing to protect them. And when they are wronged, there's nobody to go to complain. There's nobody to go to seek protection. And that just has to be, I just can't imagine what that life is like.
Yeah.
Permanently.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, like you said, like, you can leave, right? You know, so there's always that safety net in the back of your mind of like, hey, I can fucking leave right now if I wanted, whereas they can't.
Yeah.
You know, that is their world, their reality. And that, again, I wish I wish everybody here understood that, you know, and I wish that they didn't take for granted and bicker about the things that we bicker about here, when it could be not even 1,000 times worse. Man, I don't even know how you put a number X times, you know, worse than that. But from the time that you first started reporting, and you know, amongst your travels throughout the region, from kind of a macro standpoint, did you see, or how did you see the shift, if at all, of kind of how the war shaped, and how ISIS took a huge stronghold and then diminished down, and I can only assume, and having been a spectator through all of that, living here in the United States, just watching what would happen, you know, kind of the contrast, if it was noticeable on the ground, between the years that Obama was in office versus when Trump. Because to me, and again, if I'm flawed, please correct my assumption here. It seems like not long after Trump was elected, that there was kind of a new sheriff in town, so to speak, and things changed. It seems pretty dramatically. What was your take living through all of that?
So I definitely think that, and I talked to a lot of generals and a lot of commanders from the U.S. and from NATO while I was there, and I guess what they appreciated was, when Trump came in, he gave the very clear mandate was, you're there to defeat ISIS. You're not there to, you know, do a bunch of other things or take out Assad or whatever it may be that a lot of people in the international community would have liked to see happen. You're there to take out ISIS. And I think they appreciated that very clear mandate that enabled them to get that job done. And complete that job. And we can sit here and we can argue about, but ISIS still exists and they still have cells here and they still control a village here. But generally speaking, you know, they obviously have no control over major cities anymore. And they're still a threat, absolutely, but it's more wiping them out of that actual territorial control. And I think that Trump deserves credit for sort of giving that clear mandate, that I think when there are too many goals in a situation, can you achieve all of them? When you have one, you kind of know what you're going for. And so I think that was sort of appreciated on the ground in that sense. But, having said that, a lot of the bulk and the heavy lifting was also done under the Obama administration in at least sort of plotting out and beginning that huge operation to get them out as well. And I think I was trying to sort of raise alarm bells early on, and I think it's a problem now and going to be a problem going forward. And that is with the rise of ISIS coming the rise of the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. And I think that is going to definitely be a point of contention in how the U.S. sort of decides what policy it wants to take from here forward.
Yeah. Did you notice a shift personally on the ground, I guess, during that time where it was like, things are different now? Like, did you see a tide turning, so if you would?
It's funny. In the beginning, what I noticed a lot was this sort of idea where people automatically assumed that the U.S. was going to come in immediately and almost this superhero Captain America figure that was going to just kind of wipe out this group and give them all the weapons they needed to also do the job. And this would all be over in a few weeks. And when it wasn't, you'd sort of get a year in, 18 months in, and people you felt that loss of hope. You started to suddenly think that it was never going to change, and people there were just that sense of hopelessness or the belief or the optimism that they felt that it was going to all sort of be over very quickly had very much left. And it was sort of this very deep trauma and deep sense of sadness of feeling like it was just what life was. And then I think then subsequently in the year that sort of came after that, when things were moving and ISIS started to fall fairly quickly, once you started to see that happen, I guess people started to, to believe that things could change. But I caveat that with even after ISIS left, I can't tell you the amount of people that I talked to that attempted to go home only to realize that there wasn't anywhere to go. There was no home, or there was still some, form of a threat where they were living, or there was no electricity. And so people were just returning to the camps because the aftermath of it was so, we don't look at the aftermath. And even now, years later, the resources, when something's not in a headline, when ISIS is no longer the headline news, the resources dwindle. So you're looking at situations in camps and places and cities that are just completely demolished, and there is zero help for anyone. And so it's almost a worse situation for a lot of them now than it was even sort of at the height of ISIS, where there was money coming in, or there was camps that were being set up and things like that. They've all gone away, but the problem is still there, and that is that everything was just wiped to the ground.
So it's maybe not as dangerous, but even worse in terms of infrastructure and what their daily life is like.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of it, especially the Christian communities in Iraq, they feel just as threatened by the Iranian-backed militias that are there than they did by ISIS. So these are, for them, it's a new threat, different label, I guess.
Yeah. This is a little off topic, but when you mentioned Iran-backed militias, how did you view the killing of Soleimani?
Oh, I thought that was great.
Yeah.
I mean, that man he was extremely smart military man. It was involved, I think, very heavily in a lot of those operations on the ground, especially in Syria. Very calculating, and I think he really was. When they call him the mastermind, it's for a reason.
Yeah. And so despite losing him, you still see those groups continuing to expand in Iraq.
Yeah, I mean, they're Iraqis. It's this misconception they're from Iran. They're not. They're Iraqis themselves who are loyal to Iran as opposed to Baghdad. But they're being brought into the umbrella of the Baghdad government, which means they're getting salaries from Baghdad as part of the larger armed forces. But they have no allegiance to Iraq itself.
Why is that? I mean, is it because it's not the old Baghdad, and they find more common ground with
the sort of the Shia religious sector, and so that is Tehran, who's the sort of the epitome of that. They view it's religion over country, I guess,
Yeah.
in that sense. And it's control and money and all the other things that come with corruption and power. But I think it's a problem that the US has to contend with, because they are very well armed and they are very well trained, and they are also very well respected, I must add, by a lot of Iraqis, in the sense that people looked at them as being, I remember when I was there, someone described it to me as, you have the Iraqi army, which are, okay, or improved at a lot of the combat and things, but to them, the Hashtashabi, which is the Iranian militias, they're the street fighters. They're the ones who don't give a shit about the rules and what they're told, and there's no rules of engagement, and they don't give a fuck what happens, but they're going to go in and they're going to bust ISIS's ass. And in the places that they were allowing the Hashtashabi to go in and fight, the US took some more of a backseat. And so the analogy that Iraqis had was, well, when we let Hashtashabi fight, there was less airstrikes, and therefore the cities weren't as demolished. So, and people really viewed them as these sort of, I guess, national treasures that without them, they could never have defeated ISIS. So the level of sort of respect that they get from that, I think, gets underplayed by the media too, in some ways, because they're quite embraced, or at least they were embraced by Iraqis a lot. And then I think things have shifted a little bit with all the protests and things that have happened there over the past few years, and people have started to see the power grabs and things like that. But they do have support on the ground.
Where do you see Iraq and Syria, for that matter, kind of going in the next few years?
Well, I mean, it's been 10 years of war in Syria, and I just think it's been an absolute failure of the international community to negotiate any type of agreement on the behalf of the Syrian people. It looks like Assad's won that pretty squarely, and to me that's a real shame, given that just the atrocities that have been committed against the Syrian people. And it's unfathomable to me. I work a lot with Syrian burned children that we bring to get some help at Shriners here, and there's just thousands of them on the waiting list, and just what they've had to experience is just is a slice of what that war looks like. But it's shocking to me that this man can still be in power. And I don't see that changing necessarily anytime soon. Iraq too, it's going to be a fairly, I think, unstable place for a while, and Iraq seems to be in a perpetual cycle of struggling to find what its identity is. And I hope that Iraqis can find a reason to fight for their country. I think that's why you see the Kurds in the north as being very effective, is because Kurdistan is the most important thing to them, over religion, over all the other things. They have this belief and a love for Kurdistan. And I just really hope that Iraqis who have proved themselves to be very, combat experienced and have all this ability to really defend their country, I just hope that they can find it from a morale point of view to want to keep fighting for it. And I think the more that there is these outside influences, whether it's Iran or the US or whoever, the more that they struggle to find that identity within themselves.
Yeah. Do you see, because Syria is still under the fist of Assad, that they have kind of a more bleak outcome than Iraq?
Yeah, I definitely think Iraq is at a place where at least it's having relatively fair elections, which is obviously important, and they're allowing different representatives, and there is hope. There is definitely hope for Iraq. Syria at this point, once you've had that dictatorship in place. Obviously, before Bashar, it was his father Hafiz. So you're looking at your typical family dictatorship there, and he just seems to be able to stick it out with the support of Iran again, with the support of Russia, and get away with all the mess, the war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the genocide is effectively done against the Syrian people. So. And nobody wants to move back into that environment either. So that's the question. All the diaspora that's sort of all over Europe, all over the US and other places, people can't go home when they know that they're going to be persecuted or thrown in jail because of their support for the opposition. So I don't see Syria coming back to life anytime soon in that sense.
Do you think that the reason that the regime in Iraq was toppled and the one in Syria still hasn't been is because of the Iran and more specifically Russian backing, is that we don't want to fuck with that and kick that hornet's nest?
I really think that was a turning point in 2000 and 15, I think, was when Russia got involved in Syria. Up until then, Assad looked like he was on the way out. I think that Russia definitely came in to save that. I also think the opposition needs to take a lot of responsibility and blame too, because it did start out as a movement of people that wanted things like free and fair elections, didn't want to be targeted, wanted to be able to live in a society that, you know, was not necessarily westernized but modernized and had those sort of general pillars of democracy. And I will always stand with that. I always believe in people's ability to live like that. And I think it's a bigoted point of view when I hear people say, oh, these, you know, they have to have a dictatorship. But I don't agree with that. But I think Assad, he got the Russian backing. Obama called a red line that never happened. And that was probably the single biggest foreign policy failure, was saying something and not doing it. I think, is it Lyndon Johnson who has that great quote about if you're going to send a man to hell, you better be prepared to do it. Or if you're going to say you're going to send a man to hell, you better be prepared to do it. And I'm using verbatim, but you get the point. And when that didn't happen, you know, that's when Russia and Iran and all these other groups kind of came in and saw that weakness and figured, well, you know, this is all talk. They're not going to do anything. And it was sort of a bit of a lost cause from there. But going back to what I said on the opposition, they need to take responsibility too, because the peace did become hijacked by outside interests. It did become hijacked by extremist groups. And it's sort of this whole vacuum enabled every player to kind of come in and want to exert influence. And the opposition did go from being something you could support and get behind to being filled with way too many extremist elements for anyone to really feel comfortable with that.
So in hearing about Russia and Iran, but again, more specifically Russia, I'm curious what your perception is of why they got involved. Do you think it's merely to poke us with a stick and just say, we're going to fuck with you, or was there a legit strategic reason?
Russia has its biggest, Russia basically owns the entire Tartus port in Syria. So that's where it has free reign for its entire navy to be able to go in and out.
Do you know why? I mean, what is the tie between Russia and Syria?
It's always had a historic tie. I think, you know, even Hafez, Assad's father, was very tightly aligned with Russia, dating back several decades. So I think...
Seems like an odd partnership.
Yeah. Russia was always able to assert its sort of military and get a lot of its assets inside Syria that it can use to then, you know, export oil to Europe, and a lot of its kind of existence, I guess, depends on that relationship with Syria. Having said that, I don't know how Putin necessarily feels about Assad himself, but I think as long as Russia's interest is somewhat taken care of in Syria, then they'll be there. But I think they have their own interests. But of course, one thing I've also found is anywhere the US is, Russia is usually there on the other side over time.
Proxy.
Yep.
Yeah. While you were there, did you see Russian soldiers, Russian influence that was obvious?
In Syria, I mean, I didn't see any Russians personally, but I definitely hear a lot of stories about it. I did see a lot when we'd go into sort of old homes that had been abandoned by ISIS fighters. I saw a lot of Russian writing, and that could be Chechen, it could be, I can't tell you exactly where it came from, but there definitely were a lot of Russian-speaking ISIS fighters that would leave their graffiti around.
Do you view Russia as big a threat as it's portrayed in our media to us?
Not really. Yes, in a sense that it likes to mess around, but I mean, its GDP is pretty crap, and you know, I don't think it has a pull in that sense. And I've spent a bit of time in Russia, and I've loved it there. And it's funny because I think there's this sort of stereotype that we get with Russia as sort of it being people being very quiet and serious and
stoic.
Yeah, and then when I went there, I couldn't have met the more lovely, warm, friendly people that
Really?
Yeah, they were just, someone who I didn't even know. Her friend, she drove like 4 hours to pick me up from an airport.
Wow.
And she was so bright and vivacious, and they introduced me to all her friends. And one of them said, we're at a dinner party in Moscow, and one of them said to me, he was using a translator. He said, "Is it true that in America all the bad guys in the films are Russian?" And I had to stop. I had never, because I'd never been asked that question. I stopped and I thought, yeah, it is true.
It's pretty true.
He's like, "Why?" And I said, "Oh,
I think it's a carryover from the Cold War. Like, it's just easy to, starting with, so the Cold War carries over into the 80s, which is kind of the peak of like action movies, right?
Yeah.
Rambo and or like say, even though I was in Vietnam, I mean, was it Rambo 3? I think he fights Russians, but there's always a Russian influence, like even in the first one, or like Rocky 4, where he goes to Russia and fights the big Russian guy, whatever. So I think, it's just kind of a carryover from that maybe, but that's funny. I hadn't thought of it really that way either. But the time that you spent in Russia, was that for work or was it pleasure or both?
Yes, it was a little bit of both. I go in the middle of winter, as you do. So that was just after the 2016 election. So it was kind of funny timing. I went to Moscow with a friend for a little bit and just kind of wanted to see it and experience it. And I had a few good friends, and then took a train down to St. Petersburg, and loved it because Russians are such culture vultures. So for me, coming from an arts background, it was like you'd go to the ballet, to the Bolshoi, to the Mariinsky, sort of the way you'd go to to a bar to watch a football game here. It's like everybody went and they would all take their, straight out of work, and it was affordable and accessible to people, or to the opera or whatever it was. And everyone would take their nice shoes in a little bag. And so you'd have the coat check and shoe check as well, because everyone would change their shoes. And so it was just cool, because I thought how nice it was to kind of be in a place and everybody was really supporting it. But I ended up going to do work in Crimea. So that was really interesting, actually, because you hear about the sort of the annexation of Crimea that had happened in 2014, and it's obviously still a big foreign policy issue and a big factor between Russia and the Ukraine. But I found it to be a fascinating little place, and a story that I wanted to understand a little bit better, and understand what the people on the ground thought of what was happening. And also, I just wanted to understand how you annex a place, how you just take it over and suddenly it's yours. And that to me was fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's reminiscent of like Middle Age history, where groups just, I'm going to take that now. Like that's not supposed to happen now, right? But it still does. And that's another thing I think a lot of people don't realize, whether it's here. People are like, well, that shit could never happen here. Like, don't say never, because shit can happen everywhere, and it is happening. Like things that you think would be impossible to happen, period, are taking place as we're sitting here talking.
And they described it as little green men. So I said, did this happen all at once? Like, what happened? And people there said, over weeks, these people that were little green men, they called them, because they were just dressed all in green and they had no insignia or anything, would just come and stand in the street.
Really?
They just come and stand in a building. And suddenly you're walking down the street and there's just little green men everywhere, and they don't speak, and you don't know what they're doing, and you don't know who they are.
Are they armed?
I think some of them were, and then some of them weren't. So for them, they were just like, this is
weird.
And then all of a sudden it started to make sense.
Yeah. So having spent time there and trying to gather perspective on not just what's going on the ground, but kind of all sides, what is your take on the entire thing?
On the takeover of Crimea? Mm-hmm. Well, I will say, from the perspective, and obviously I stand with the notion that you can't take land that doesn't belong to you. And so I very much stand with Ukraine in wanting to fight to have that. But from the perspective of people on the ground, which again, what I tried to do, And this was, this was 18 months after the takeover. So what I found was that people had said to me, the ones that were extremely pro-Ukraine in the beginning, said that, I guess how it was handled from Kyiv was that they were sort of they were ostracized, where it suddenly became very difficult for them to get a passport or to go, and they'd have to, they felt very marginalized just because they lived in Crimea. And so their allegiance shifted to Russia as it went on, because they saw their government as being hostile to them. And then they saw the Russian government as kind of embracing them and welcoming them and welcome to Russia kind of thing. And so a lot that didn't support the annexation in the beginning shifted based on that sort of sense of hostility that they felt that they were receiving just because of where they lived.
That's interesting. I mean, it's almost like a psyops kind of thing, where instead of using force and brutality of kind of the good cop mentality of getting them to shift that way, which is pretty smart.
And then I found this amazing sort of idea of a pro-sanctions group. And I thought, what is this? And I had these women telling me, we're pro-sanctions. And I thought, how can you be pro-sanctions? What is that? So obviously the US has a lot of sanctions and sanctioned Russia over what happened with Crimea. But why they're pro-sanction is because it forces them to make everything internally. So they said, well, we couldn't get our French cheese anymore, so we started making our own cheese, and our own cheese is better, and now we're making money. Or we couldn't get, XYZ, so now it forces us as communities to come together and make our own. And so you sort of had this fascinating sort of pro-sanctions movement.
All over cheese. It's funny the things that become important, in situations like that, or that stick out that way.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a situation where the United States should get involved?
I mean, it's funny. It's arbitrary to me what we choose to say, what we choose to get involved in, and what we then turn our back and say that's a bilateral issue between the countries. There's obviously a lot of disputed land. You can go, say, Kashmir between Pakistan and India, which has been a really deadly border forever because they fight over that land. When the US says that's a bilateral issue, we're not going to get involved. But the US has been a lot more heavily involved in, say, the Crimea issue. Again, I think it helps to, you can't just go around taking land, and it does help to speak and to say, to vocally condemn something. But I don't see I don't see what good the US would try to do, physically, in that has to be that has to be worked out between them and whoever's arbitrating that. And I don't think the US really has any place in sending anybody over there in that sense.
Yeah.
Unless it's an immediate kind of militarized threat.
So that leads me to, kind of the bigger picture question. President McKay, right?
Not American-born citizen.
Yeah, why not? It's all hypothetical. To me, you bring a very unique perspective. You're not biased towards America the way an American would be, right? So yeah. I think that, coupled with the fact that you've spent more time in these places than almost any U.S. soldier has. Or at least as much as most of them, right? But with a very different agenda and viewpoint or even lens that you see everything through, because again, it's very neutral. Whereas, take my time in Iraq was not neutral. Like I'm looking through an American soldier's glasses, which is very different. I'm thinking of keeping me and the guys next to me safe, and we're there to do one fucking job, and that's to break stuff and kill people and come home, and that's it. So there's a simplistic nicety that way in being in such a focused role, where I don't envy the position that you're in that way is that you're trying to not be biased and gathering everything from a multi-angled perspective. And so I'm curious then, because I do think it's really, really valuable, if you were the president of the United States, both going all the way back to, I'd even say September 12th till present day, what would you have done different, and what would you do moving forward?
I think what the U.S. is really great at, and I'll take Afghanistan in that beginning, is going in and just, we were able to go in and wipe the Taliban out in, a few weeks, basically. And then the problems rose from, well, what happens next? And that's sort of the nation building debate. It's difficult because I don't think there is any right solutions. You can go in to a country and get out really quickly and it's still a disaster. You can go in and stay in, it's still a disaster. And then you can not go in at all and it's still a disaster. So there isn't really one way in. But I think Afghanistan, I could go into this for forever, the reasons I think Afghanistan's failed. I think it's great, that the US was able to go in and really show its power. But I don't know how much point it is to have troops, doing all these kind of things when they're jobs that can be done by NGOs or USAID or, a lot of the programs that people end up kind of getting into just from the perspective of, how is it going to be perceived by the locals, and is that really the best use of our troops? And I vacillated with it a lot, but I think, for the most part, I don't see much point in having a big footprint in a lot of these places. Having said that, I also see the benefits of small footprint. Like, I really believe, say in Syria, when the US had a couple of thousand troops, I thought it was an example of a good model in how the US could still have sort of some presence, and it enables intelligence assets and other things to get a strong idea of what's happening on the ground without having to do the heavy lifting. The heavy lifting was done by the Syrian fighters, and I thought that was a good example of how the US can be engaged, have influence, and what that brought for people that were living in some of the places was this idea that, okay, well, we don't see American troops and we don't, they're not really involved, but we know they're here, and that if Russia was ever to try to come in, or the Assad regime was going to come back in and retake, or whatever it was, that wouldn't fly. So it was a deterrent in some ways without actually having to do a lot of the heavy fighting. But, for the most part, I think the last 20 years has sort of proven to us that these long wars and these sort of massive engagements are really not worth it from any point of view.
Yeah. To me, I agree wholeheartedly with both Iraq, I would say Libya, Egypt, Syria. My perspective is that very simply is that it's a shitty scenario. There's no doubt about it. But I don't see where us getting involved fixes it, and I don't think it's worth. I mean, I've got a number of friends. I'm sure, you've made a lot of friends over the years too that are now gone, because of these wars. And when I look at kind of the mean collective total of progress that we think that we've made, and I look at it and try to contrast it or leverage it, it doesn't shake out. I don't think it's worth it. I don't think it's even close to worth it.
Yeah.
The one, I think, wild card is Afghanistan for me, in that, post 9/11, yes, I agree, like something had to be done. Like, you can't just be like, well, that sucks.
Right.
You've got to punch them back in the mouth. It's what do you do after that? And my take, again, I'm curious to get your perspective as an Australian that they played a significant role in World War II also. Is, to me, World War II is kind of a consummate textbook example of how to do it right, in that you don't get involved until basically you're forced to.
Yeah.
There's an existential threat to your way of life if you do nothing, and then you put the entire weight of the entire goddamn country behind it, not just the U.S. military. I mean, you've got moms and kids collecting tin cans to recycle to build planes, and all this. The entire country is behind this, and you send everybody over there until the job is finished. There's not 3 months in, 3 months out. Like, yeah, it's better for the mental health and stability of soldiers, but in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of like having a rotating manager at McDonald's. Like, the product is going to suck worse because of that. Like, yeah, it's better to have breaks, but there's something to be said for going over there and saying, you guys aren't coming home until you fucking crush it.
Right.
Like that's going to make people want to crush it even more. Not that they don't to begin with, but there's a sense of urgency there, the Viking burning of the boats type of mentality, I think. Right. I think when that is coupled with saying, okay, we are changing your culture because of this. And similarly, like, we're still in Germany, we are still in Japan. and we did what we had to do to ensure that never cropped back up, and to me, like, it's still not ideal. It's still not perfect. There's still going to be a shitload of people that shouldn't have been killed that are going to die. But I think that, again, looking at all of the lesser of all evils, is that I can't think of a better way to kind of handle your business as a nation as it relates to foreign policy than that as an example. Now, where I think it would be tough with Afghanistan and trying that is that, we didn't do that. We just like kind of the first Iraq war, I think we, kicked over the hornet's nest, killed all the hornets that we could see, and then backed out, and all the reserves came out of nowhere, and then it was a cat and mouse game, for years. Whereas in World War II, we stayed there and continued to root it out until they were completely gone, and we changed their society forever. What is your thoughts on that?
So we look at the Taliban. These are mounted militiamen fighting with an old AK-47. Why are they so strong still?
Resilience.
I think that we failed to get to the root of the problem in Afghanistan, which was the sheer levels of corruption that happen on a government level. And when you have to go to work every day and you have to pay off a police officer half your salary just to get to your job sweeping the street, and your government doesn't have your back, and there's a constant level of corruption, and you're seeing everyone around you, take money, you have to pay this person, you have to get this, you get pissed. And even if you're not driven by any form of religion, sort of extremism, you're going to join an insurgency, or you're going to support an insurgency that is going to fight against a government because you've lost faith that your government has your back. And I really think that over the years, and I've brought this up so many times, often the US looks at this systemic corruption, whether it's Afghanistan, and if you've ever read the SIGAR reports that come out from the Inspector General there, they will just infuriate you. The level of waste, things, lost due to corruption. Somebody gets $1 billion contract for translating who doesn't know how to speak Pashto, or, whatever. Like, it's unfathomable. Yeah. So, when that happens time after time, there's a reason the Taliban has the support in communities and even not just in the fighting rank, but just in the communal rank. And that is because people look at them as a fighter against a system that they can never change or break into. And I think the US has made the mistake over the years of looking at the corruption as being just too big to deal with. And I think these groups are so often symptoms of that rather than being causes of that. And I just think if more efforts were put into not tolerating some of that bullshit, not tolerating you selling off this to that, the aid money we give you, if there was accountability to where that money went, who gobbled up that money, why didn't it go to the people? Well, you're not getting any more until it does. And sort of getting a lot more, clamping down on that a lot more and enforcing a shift. I mean, we didn't even know who the last president was in the Afghanistan election. It was, again, second time in a row, we didn't know who won. They both won, both claiming victories. I mean, what is this? It's a circus. And until you want to get to the bottom of the circus, these groups are going to exist.
So I guess, again, from, like, let's say you're running the show, how do you? Is it just a corruption accountability, or do you have to go further than that? Like, let's say you step into being in charge of Afghanistan, and now you're tasked with figuring it out. What would you do? I
mean, it's all piece by piece. You have to take it step by step, and I think it's great. A lot of the work, again, that SIGAR has done in highlighting the level of corruption, and that is. In bringing it to light, at least. But then where's the accountability when it is brought to light? So I think the US, obviously we as taxpayers have spent a lot in Afghanistan. And so we need something to prove that there is genuine change, I think, that is happening within that system. I mean, things like the election, that should just never have happened. We don't want to be the overlord. We don't want to be the micromanager, but until you can show that things are being done fairly, maybe the US has to take more of a a stronger role in that sort of diplomatic and maybe less of a military sense and a more of a sort of a diplomatic sense in trying to get it aligned, because the more that exists, the more that all the other problems will exist.
At this point, given, it's been over 20 years,
Yeah.
or almost right at 20 years, I guess, would you stay there? Do you think we should still be fucking with them, or would you just say, you know what?
No.
Just leave. Just be done with it.
I want to say just leave and be done with it. The biggest losers in that will be the women, because they're there's obviously been a lot of progress for them in being able to leave their house, get a job, have a sense of identity and outside of that. And they really will lose that immediately when the US leaves. But at least from a military point of view, I don't, again, unless it's going to be just a very small contingency, a similar model to Syria, where you have 1,000 to 2,000 troops that are just kind of there as a deterrent, to facilitate intelligence gathering or whatever it may be. I support that because I think that's a good deterrent at some point. But these large scale, I don't know what else is left to be done. I don't know what you can do from a military point of view anymore.
Do you feel the same way about Iraq?
Yeah, I do.
Do you feel that, and again, hindsight, so it's 2020, but do you think Iraq entirely was a mistake?
Again, I mean, Saddam Hussein was, he did a lot of really fucking awful things to people. And again, I support everybody's desire to live under a somewhat of a democracy, or at least a non-dictatorship, and that obviously didn't exist in Iraq.
Do you think he's any worse than Assad or Gaddafi?
I mean, they're all they're cut from the same cloth. Yeah. So no, he was no worse. And so I think the overall premise for us going into to Iraq, because obviously we can look back and say that was flawed, and what business did we have being there? And I think I definitely agree with it in that sense. But I do think it's still important to acknowledge at least that, I think there's the part of me that still says, he did a lot of terrible things and met his downfall in that way. But I think everything that came after that just proved to be a disaster. There was just a lack of understanding of, I guess, the culture and what the Iraqi people wanted. And I don't know how many of the Iraqi people at that point, even as much as except for the Kurds who hated Saddam because of what he did in chemically bombing them in the 80s, but a lot of Iraq too, just that was all they knew. So I don't know how much import was given to what the Iraqi people wanted before that happened.
Yeah. But
I definitely think for the most part that was a pretty big mistake to wade.
I remember just a few minutes ago you mentioned the bigoted viewpoint that some take of many of these countries need a dictator. I'll be the first to admit there is absolutely an element of me seeing, the things that happen there, of thinking, not that I think that that's great, but sure. I find myself wondering, like, well, what else would work then?
Right.
And I'm curious, how do you manage that region then? Because to me it's so primal in the sense that it's so many things take place there out of force,
right?
And compulsion and just brute strength of that. I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I have more people, whatever, that I'm going to take what I want. Whether it's your wife, whether it's your kids, whether it's your stuff, whether it's this village, your crops, whatever. It's very, medieval times fucking Viking mentality in a lot of ways still there. And so how do you kill corruption, maintain an even enough keel between the people to where you don't allow groups of people rising up and forming a powerful enough band to go do something, and then you as a government has to kind of snuff them out or crush them or whatever, when there's enough of that's just ingrained in their society. So what would be your solution to that, if not a brutal dictatorship?
Right. So I think, it's difficult, but, and these things definitely take time and they come, but, if there can be I guess, a free election that the majority of people freely vote for, in power with, these different religious groups and they're all, have their voice. Everybody wants their voice and are fairly represented in whatever that government can look like. And if people can view their government as somebody who they can be proud of, and obviously you're always going to have opposition. We have a ton of opposition here, but someone that has their best interests, I think that is the number one thing. And it's basic things. And again, these things take time, but I look at issues like land rights, and to us, we're used to, having that right. If you buy property, you rent property, whatever it is that you have, that is yours to own. And I think that is something in the Middle East that people just have never had security in. And that was the whole reason the Arab Spring started in Tunisia. Eventually a guy selling fruit just got sick of, the government coming in and taking his fruit stand away from him that he owned for no recourse. And he set himself on fire. And so I see that as a sort of analogy for that whole region and what can be done to give people that sense of, I don't know if it's the right word, but almost a capitalistic sense that we have in the US, where you can come from nothing and make something for yourself. You can own property. You can start a business. You can, do a lot of these things and know that the government can't just come in and take it from you with no recourse for no good reason. And so I think it's basic things like that, basic principles that there needs to be a bigger push from some of these governments. If the right leader was in power to do that, again, it's getting that right person. But yeah, I mean, if you're just going to pass it down through a family line every time, where's the sort of the fairness in that?
Yeah, there isn't any. To me, where the tricky part is that, take even here in the United States, right, is that there's plenty of evil that exists here. Mm-hmm. It's kept in check by enough of morally driven, fair-minded people that believe in a sense of justice and equity, equality, fairness, judicial justice, etc., that are keeping those people in check. And to me that's a cultural thing that you can't not force, but even inspire from a government if they're not. And so to me it's again, like, at the risk of sounding like a total asshole pessimist, I just don't see a society where corruption and family dynasties are the norm, of them policing themselves and deciding, we're going to give up this really fucking good deal that we have for the fairness of our entire populace, right? Is that, that's hard enough to do it here. Fuck, for that matter, our own election, this past one, is in pretty heavy question by a lot of people, enough people for it to potentially jeopardize future elections, right. I would say. And so to me, it's akin also, I think, to when, something shady happens in our government and our government investigates itself and finds that nobody was at fault. It's like, yeah, fuck you guys.
Right.
And so to me, that's kind of the everlasting struggle that every one of these countries is always going to have, is that, you've got to basically start completely over, because these people that are in that position of power, take even our own Congress and Senate. Like there's a reason every one of those assholes comes in being worth $140,000, and 4 years later they're worth $6.7 million. Right. And that's not an accident, and so once they're in those positions, and again, this is not pointed at one party, they're both equally fucking guilty, is that, they don't want term limits because it sucks for them. And once they're in that position, they're not giving it up, you see that with the left trying to bring in more states and more senators and change filibuster rules and all these things to make it even harder for them to be booted out of the position of power that they're in. And so if that can happen here, where by contrast we are far, far more fair and balanced than these other countries are in that regard, I don't see how you do that. Take the election, which I agree, like, it starts with that, is that the people have to believe that it was a fair and free election, and that the guy or whoever the person is that got voted for, is that it's legit. Like, if that's not there, nothing else works, right? But here's the hard part with that is that, well, how do you make that happen? Well, you can only make that happen if the entire country is on board, if everybody counting the ballots is on board, if everybody who funneling up the chain is legit people who are honest. I mean, you saw enough examples here in this country of ballots being lost and people moving shit around in the middle of the night and thumb drives showing up at 4 a.m. and now all of a sudden there's 400,000 more votes for somebody. Like, if that's enough to shake our confidence, like how the fuck do you start over in a country that's war torn, blown to shit, with massive corruption from the top that makes ours look like the fucking Boy Scouts, and start over and make it to where it's going to be good? I don't know how you do that.
I mean, again, it takes time. And it's about, having, you've got to be proud of your country to start with, but in a point where it's not an indoctrinated sort of nationalistic,
like North Korea.
Yeah. But you've got to believe in your country, and you've got to want to fight for it. And, in a situation like Syria, it would probably take a multi sort of group of international players to kind of, I don't want to use the word supervise, but to have a hand, at least in the beginning, of trying to find that right person that can be trusted and observing an election. And it's just that one at a time kind of stepping up. Let's get the Syrian people back to their country if they want to be there. And most of them do. They don't want to be living in, a lot of the other places. They want to be in Syria. And I think it's just starting. It's starting from the ground up. It's giving people that confidence. It's giving the people, an ability to, and I think this is where, refugees are extraordinary. They have an ability to start over that a lot of us probably don't have, that sort of resilience where they're so used to losing everything and rebuilding it again, without all the sort of the challenges and complaints that I think I would go through if that was me. So it's a piece by piece, and there's no magic bullet, but I think you have to keep believing that change can happen.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think for me, again, I may be a little biased given my background of.
But we're so fortunate to have the American Constitution here. I mean.
Well, so long as it's continued to be followed, which, I mean, even that's up for debate at this point. But
that's such a work of art that it's extraordinary, the vision of the founding fathers and when they were building this country and how they saw these things. They saw what could happen back then, and they sort of cemented that. And I would hate to think what the US would be like if we sort of didn't at least have that sort of resolute document that has put it together.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm proponent of that driving every answer to every question you have as to whether or not we should do something. It's such a priceless, brilliant document that I agree. Like I'm fascinated by the fact that at that time that they had the ability to craft that the way that they did. It's truly remarkable.
Totally.
I guess, in terms of relating it back to, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, what have you, is that to me, like as a AA personality guy, I think, I always understand that at the end of the day, when all else fails, negotiation, diplomat, resolutions and or otherwise, is that who can kick the shit out of the other guy is ultimately what it may come down to, not will come down to, but can come down to if everything else fails. And to me, that's the part where I just don't see in any of these countries going back to do they need a dictatorship? Maybe not necessarily, but to me, in each one of these countries' current form, I would say the answer is yes, for them to at least survive in some sort of normalcy. Not that it's an acceptable normalcy, but at least one where their country isn't being bombarded nonstop. Shy of that, you would have to completely overthrow and replace the entire government, military, et cetera, with a non-corrupt replacement. Because otherwise, again, I think you're just gonna face the same thing here. Is that if we try to implement elections and polling places are getting blown up and people counting ballots are getting kidnapped and voting official supervisors are getting their heads cut off because whatever, like that's never gonna pan out. And these people are clearly not just capable but willing to go to those measures to protect the positions of power that they're in, the same way that people are here, just extravagantly more so there. But anyway, I think
if we can start somewhere and do it with the goal of not having to intervene militarily.
I guess I just don't know how you do that.
Yeah.
Because again, if they kick it to that notch, right? If we try to take the diplomatic approach and use negotiations and diplomacy to enact this, and they say, yeah, no, it sounds good, and then they just do
what they want
to do anyway, and just enact violence the same way that they have proven to do for decades. Then what? It's like, to me, like it's, I don't know if you're a fan of Jordan Peterson at all, but
I was just listening to one of his lectures.
Yeah, I mean, to me, like there's so many brilliant aspects to a lot of the things that he says, because they're very relevant in a lot of these things, and that the ability to negotiate really hinges on the fact that both parties know that if that fails, you're going to fight, whether it's two guys disagreeing about something, or on the micro, or at the macro, two countries, or even unionized versions of groups of countries that are trying to negotiate something for whatever you're talking about, is that both sides understand that if we can't come to terms here, we're going to fucking fight. And that's what gives people the ability to actually negotiate, because if that threat of that is not behind that, then who gives a shit if you come to an agreement or not? It doesn't matter.
Right.
To me, it's the same problem that you see in social media, is that people have no problem running their mouth in a fashion in which they absolutely would not do it in person, because they know that there is no fear of getting punished for it. Is that they can say whatever they want with absolutely no consequence. So there's no reason to be amicable, right? Because there's no consequence for not being so. So anyway, we could talk about it for days, I'm sure, but I wanted to pivot a little bit. One of the things that popped up I was curious about is, what's the nastiest thing you ever ate while you were overseas?
God. I've been sick so many times.
Yeah. Did you get sick a lot, like food poisoning?
Usually once every trip. Yeah, once every trip. It was a couple of trips I was almost having to be hospitalized. But I
remember what it was that you ate that?
You know what? I think in Iraq one time I smoked way too much hookah, like just breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, and I think I reckon I had nicotine poisoning, and it was the middle of summer.
Dehydrated.
Yes, I was super dehydrated. In terms of nasty, I mean, I pretty much, I try not to complain too much and just kind of take whatever is given to me when I'm there. I can't think of anything too nasty. What about you?
Well, probably a bamboo bat in the Philippines is the thing that comes to mind as being the most disgusting thing I've ever tried. To watch these Filipino seals pull these tiny little bamboo bats out of chambers of bamboo, and just the way that they extracted them was fascinating.
What did it taste like?
Like a salty. It was a little burnt too, because they took really fine shoots of bamboo and skewered them, and then kind of rotisseried them over a fire, and so it was kind of a charred, salty loogie with crunchy collagen bones, because you ate the whole thing.
Right.
So it was just gross. I mean, it wasn't like eating something rotten gross. It was just the texture was, again, kind of like a crunchy snotty loogie that was burnt. But
I remember now one time I went to this little place in Syria on the side of the road, and my driver ordered me fish. Oh, we have fish. And I said, where's the fish from? Oh, it's from the Euphrates. Okay. I'll tell you what. And I think I posted, sent a picture to my friend, to the former team guy, and he's like, do you know how many dead bodies are in that? Yeah. I was sick for 2 days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
God,
no fish from the Euphrates. I didn't think it had much taste, to be honest. I probably put a lot of salt on it.
Yeah.
And smoked a lot of hookah with it.
Yeah. So smoking the hookah pipe was a pretty common thing for you over there?
Yeah, it was a bit of a bad habit I brought back with me.
You have one here?
Well, I used to have one both in my LA apartment in New York, and I would smoke it for breakfast. I found this coffee-flavored Aguila, and I'd smoke it for breakfast, and I was just smoking it all the time. I thought, okay, this has to go. So eventually I gave it away. We parted with it, and it was difficult, but I still go when I can and have a shisha with a friend. It's kind of fun.
That's awesome. Do you have a question?
What's your favorite sound?
Sound? In what way? Like music sound?
Just like any sound.
I'm still a big lover of classical music. So whenever I kind of need to tune out or, take a break from the world in some way or need to refocus my brain, I still go back to some of those kind of classics.
Do you have a favorite composer?
Bach.
Yeah.
I'm a Bach girl. Yeah.
I'd have to go Canon in B is probably my favorite song of all time in that regard. I'm not a huge classical fan, but that song without question always.
Yeah.
Pachelbel always strikes true for my taste. Anything else?
I would choose cereal.
I don't eat cereal, actually.
Hookah flavored.
Hookah flavored.
Or cereal flavored
I
hookah.
don't eat cereal. But yeah, I remember when I was at boarding school, we'd all fight over the Cocoa Pops. I think I lived on cereal and that's why I can't eat it. I think for about 6 months of my life, every meal was some sort of form of not very nutritious, sugary cereal. And gave it up after that.
Yeah. Curiosity. So it's always funny what people are curious about.
Yeah.
In terms of all of the places that you've been, is there one group in a specific group, not even like ISIS, within the ranks of everywhere that you've been that you find the most threatening / scary?
I think in Africa.
Which
I think it was more just sort of some of the ragtag militias that were coming out of Somalia, that in the Congo, that were just terrifying because it was so ruthless, and
like far more ruthless than the ISIS guys.
Yeah,
How
far
so?
more ruthless. The level of killing. I remember talking to some women in a village that had to run because one of them had triplets, and they were so terrified that if anyone had found out that they had triplets, and then 2 of them would have been taken away for sort of a sacrifice, and there were just these terrible things. The women that I speak to, and this is when I really sort of numbed out and had to take a break, was just women that had all these babies from rape, and just the levels of things were so unimaginable still and when I read today, just so unimaginable that they happen. Family members being forced to rape each other, just literally just the worst of what I can hear. It shakes me, and I still feel that some of the worst stories I've ever heard have come out of there, and also cartel stories, work I've done in Mexico as well. A lot of the sort of the levels of brutality, make ISIS kind of seem like a bit of a
Junior
cakewalk.
varsity.
Yeah.
Is there, I guess, of everything that's going on in the world, kind of going back to the big picture, what do you think we should be doing that we're not, or different, or whatever? Like, because to me, this is a pretty common hotbed political football. That's like the world police thing. It's like, God, there's so many atrocities that go on, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa, the Horn, the Middle East, fucking China, Mexico, you name it. Like, clearly we can't get involved in everything. And so to me, I again go back to World War II, is that, hey, all that stuff sucks and I'd love to help you, but it's kind of like being on a sinking ship or an almost sinking ship and having so many people come on to where you end up sinking it and fuck everybody over. But so in your opinion, like, what do you do about everything that's going on? Anything?
I think, and this has always been put in a negative light, and I don't think it should be put in a negative light. And people say, well, the U.S. only gets involved in things where it has an interest. And I think, well, the U.S. should only get involved in a place where it has an interest, and that should be something that is a direct threat to the United States of America and the homeland here. And that is the only time, that I think, given the scale of conflicts that exist, that is the only time that America should think about taking a bigger action. Other than that, we can support aid groups. NGOs do a lot of great work on a humanitarian level, obviously relying on private donations, but governments can donate if they want, and a lot of states do. But in terms of large-scale involvements in any place or interference, that should come only when it's identified as a direct threat. And I think that, I don't think that's a negative thing. Having said that, I look at China as being a really important player in the foreign policy piece going forward, given, I guess, the growth in their economy and obviously, what's happened with the pandemic, and, making sure this doesn't happen again, that we can't afford to deal with this shit again. So I think China is going to be an important piece in that. And obviously Mexico is our neighbor, and the number of drug-related deaths that happen, is huge. And Trump was right in declaring that to be a national emergency, and it is. And we have to address that with our neighbors, given that so much is coming from Mexico and Latin America.
With the work that you've done down there, do you see the border as being a pretty clear-cut issue of there needs to be one and it needs to be maintained, or what's your take on it?
I think it's interesting because every country I visit, whether the borders are porous or they're not, but a lot of countries, like you go between Turkey and Syria and you will freaking get shot if you cross that border. So the idea of a border is what makes a country, I guess. And I think there needs to be, I don't know whether that needs to necessarily be a physical wall or anything else, but there needs to be some form of, checks and balances in how that is controlled. And I don't think it's wrong for any country to want to know who's coming in and who's coming out. Obviously, you're never going to have 100%, lockdown on that. And there's always going to be ways in and ways out. But I do believe that I don't think it should be, it's been misconstrued as being this sort of bad thing to want to know who's here and who's not and how they're here and why they're here. And I think that's America's right to know that.
I agree. I'm baffled, frankly, at the disconnect between so many people. And I get that it's largely because, the guy that I don't like politically thinks the other thing, so I just by default think the opposite, which I think
Right.
is absurd. But I am curious, from growing up elsewhere and being all over these places, similarly to, myself also, like I've been to every place I've been to, like you can't just go from one place to the next.
Right.
And I think that makes sense. Why do you suppose there are so many fucking people here that don't get that?
I wish I had a great answer for you. I think there's a lot of different, agendas at play in that. I think it's great on one level that, people that, want to show their compassion in that sense. But let's be realistic in it's okay to, how do I say this diplomatically? It's okay.
You don't have to be diplomatic. This is Mike Driver. You can say whatever the fuck you want.
So I just think, and what I really noticed, especially at the last election, is so many people that I talk to who obviously, and no one wants to see any images, regardless of whatever administration it is, of, a child in a cage. I think it's atrocious. But at what point did we start caring more about, I guess, the outside than what a lot of our own, what a lot of American children on the streets every day are kind of encountering? And I think that should be America's focus. Is we need to, and that's not to say not to be compassionate human beings. And I know that the situations in some of those countries are really difficult. But I also believe, and I'm someone who has a lot of refugee friends and supports, what refugees have gone through. But there's a big difference between a refugee and a migrant. Mm-hmm. And a refugee is somebody who's just has no choice, and they're fleeing because their life depends on it, and they're, for whatever reason, fleeing sort of a level of persecution that I will never, hopefully, ever have to comprehend. Economic migrants are in a really tough situation, and life might suck, and they might not be able to get a job, but that doesn't give you the legal right to migrate to another country. And the reason that we have the refugee laws and the Geneva Conventions is to prioritize refugees that need that help, whereas economic migrants, there's no legal framework for that. So I think that argument's lost, where people don't really understand the difference between those two,
refugees
things
and
the importance of understanding the difference of it. And I just think it was baffling with sort of the how those coming in was sort of given, I guess, more credence in the a lot of political campaigns than Americans. And I don't know why it's such a a hot button issue to want to put your country in a place of priority.
Yeah. I couldn't have said it better myself. I agree. It's refreshing, I guess, to see somebody with a very different background than mine that shares that viewpoint for sure. To me, it seems like common sense. That's on the macro level. If you go to the micro scale of, let's say it's your house surrounded by a huge homeless population, and they come to your door.
Right.
And it's like, okay, yeah, I helped this first person. I brought them in. I let them sleep on the couch. They shower. I feed them, whatever. And then now another family shows up. Like at some point, you're like, hey, fuckers, I can't take any more of you in.
Right.
And it's like that. There's where that disconnect, I think, is really dangerous in this country. Is that people who are on face value and in their normal day-to-day lives right now are completely unaffected by whoever the fuck comes in here. That doesn't make any bit of difference. And it's easy for them to feel better about themselves by saying, yeah, no, come on in. We're a nation of immigrants. Fucking come. It's like, yeah, we are, but there's still a process that makes sense where you're only taking people that, only so many that you can actually afford to take in and help, not to where it becomes a detriment to your own country, and also making sure that dangerous people, that bad people, that completely unskilled people that are only coming here because they don't like the shit sandwich that they're in, but it's not particularly dangerous. It's just, poverty stricken. Like, again, that's, you guys got to figure that out, but,
yeah,
at any rate, the kind of the curiosity I have in hearing you talk about that turning point moment for you, with the gentleman and his wife, being taken and not being able to come up with enough money. Is there a polar opposite scenario that happened while you were over there? One that gave you legitimate hope where you're like, wow, we are making a difference, or there is something positive coming out that was ever kind of a light switch moment for you like that?
I think, I'm sure there are. The book tends to kind of go into the more difficult ones, but I think for me, I guess there was one moment of getting a sense of hope, and that actually came from an Iraqi soldier. And I remember it was after the Mosul offensive, and sort of sitting there and talking to a bunch of these guys that I kind of knew over the course of several years, who were really lazy in the beginning, and again, they didn't know what they were fighting for and who they were fighting, and were sort of part of the whole pack that ran away in the early Mosul days and abandoned their weapons. And then in reconnecting with them 4 years later, they gave me hope in the sense that I saw something. I saw a desire to fight for Iraq. I saw not only, having 4 years of incredible combat experience, but I saw this sort of sense of they understood their country, they understood what they were capable of, and they understood that it was on them to keep it that way. They'd had this massive sort of triumph, and they weren't going to sort of put up with any more shit. So I guess it was almost like a growing up that I encountered with some of the guys who were probably, when I first met them, probably 19, 20, and so when I met them again, they were in their mid-20s, and yeah, it was like they'd grown up and become these men who knew what they were fighting for. And to me, I thought that was special.
Yeah. In dealing with young men that way, did you ever find, and I know there's a ton of women reporters, but did you ever find that to be a hurdle, or cause any issues or get into trouble because they didn't respect you or think, I'm not going to talk to you? Did you ever come across that?
Not really. Generally found, you get a few odd stares. I did have one experience where it was a driver for someone who had broke into my room at one point and tried to grab me, and I went for, it was that instinct of, when I think somebody told me when I was about 10 years old to go for the nose.
Kick him in the nuts.
Yeah. I actually went for the nose because he was like coming at me, and I went for the nose, and he ran away pretty fast. So that was sort of, a physical encounter, but generally I yeah, generally people have always been really respectful. You go further south in Iraq, I guess below Baghdad, and you're looking at the really religious areas in Najif. And so a few of those where you have to be fully covered as a woman. And I think that was really the first time for me that women are generally treated as kind of a third gender when you're going into these places. So I'm not expected to sort of behave like they're women, but I'm not a man. So I'm kind of this arbitrary thing in between where it's actually really great because it gives you access to everybody.
With low expectations.
Yeah, I can go and sit with the women and get their stories, and then I can go into the other room and with the guys. So yeah, so it was a great from an access point of view that my male colleagues don't have. But yeah, so when I went further south, and it was during sort of before the Ashura, which is the big Shia kind of event in October. That was the first time that I really experienced people who wouldn't look at me and wouldn't shake my hand and wouldn't even acknowledge me. And that was a kick in the guts. I thought that I would be kind of whatever and ready for that. But when I was with a male Iraqi friend of mine, and everyone shaking his hand and literally would not even look at me. Yeah, it was like you were invisible. And that was... Yeah, it was sort of I reeled for a little bit.
Well, and that's a pretty common experience for females across the board in a lot of different parts of that region, right? Where they're basically invisible. You know?
Yeah.
Where do you see the entire region going over the next 20 years?
That's a tough one. I guess a lot depends on... Iran is sort of a major centerpiece in what policies that we decide to take with that because of its tentacles and its proxy spread. So yeah, I think that's going to be a major issue in that. But I don't know that we're going to see any grandiose sweeping changes.
What would you do to ensure? I know you talked about one thing at a time and trying to get elections, but when push comes to shove and you've got to do something or nothing. I think you mostly answered it earlier, but I mean, do you think the United States should basically just say, you know what, we're fucking out of here and leave the entire region?
I definitely have days like that, but on a more rational day, I will say that I think of really small presence, because, and I say that because when the US did completely withdraw from Iraq in 2011, and then ISIS came in several years later, Iraqis, even the Kurds turned to Iran because that was their neighbor who could get in there immediately and assist them. And the US, obviously we have to mobilize assets and things take a long time. So it took several weeks or months even before the US decided to recommit to that. And had there just been a small contingency, again, it's that deterrent factor. I don't want to see Americans fighting and dying. I don't want to see, anyone from the U.S. having to sacrifice their life for that. But I do think it has, again, from a psychops perspective, a benefit to just a small footprint.
It's like the kids. Your parents are gone, but there's a camera in the house, right?
Right. And then again, it's an issue that I've looked into and want to explore is the militia side of it in what private companies, could that be a more effective way of handling some of these conflicts in a way that sort of doesn't have the US sort of stamp government wise, but maybe they can, do more effectively and quietly and still have that deterrent impact if needed.
Yeah.
Does it have to be the US, active military?
Yeah. I think that where it's tricky is take Libya as probably a good example of on paper and in theory it sounds great to just help the rebels overthrow it, but because it's so corrupt to begin with, it just doesn't pan out that way. I mean, you can go back to Somalia, Mogadishu, in 93, same thing. That's the whole reason we were there, is because all this help that we're trying to give isn't getting to where it needs to go, and so the whole region is tricky. I mean, there's not a simple solution, but it's really both fascinating and remarkably enjoyable to be able to ask you these questions and get your perspective, because I do I know that it's really valuable, and I value it very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you ever want to go back?
Not on purpose.
Yeah.
No, I mean, my stance on it is pretty clear cut that way. Is that I think some of life's most complicated problems require some of the simplest solutions, and I think that's kind of one of them. Is that when I look at the friends that I've lost, the amount of money and resources that we've spent, the headaches and grievances, in the grieving process that so many families have gone through, because one soldier dying isn't just doesn't just affect one person, it affects lots of people, and that's not even taking into account the tens of thousands of people who've been mutilated, lost limbs and been burnt and TBIs to where they can't live a normal life, so it's kicked our country in the nuts pretty hard for 20 years, and when I look at what's going on there and what we've given as a business guy, it's impossible for me not to look at it at least somewhat from a cost benefit analysis standpoint of saying, like, what did we get for what we gave? And we got fucking zero for it, and to me, that's bad business. I don't care if you're fighting a war or running a popsicle stand, those principles are true irrespective of what situation you find yourself in. And so I hate the fact that, a number of my very close friends and some of the best men that I'll ever know are now dead before even at the age that I am now, because of what we're doing and have done and continue to do over there. So that's my take on it. But,
yeah. And if not now, when?
Yeah. Any other questions you have for me?
No.
I always like getting asked questions because I'm usually the asshole. It's always
what year were you out?
It was right after Obama was elected, November of 2008. So.
Right.
So I've now been out about as long as I was in, which is weird.
Right.
But so what now for you? Are you ever going to settle down?
I want to. Yeah. I mean, I literally been on the road for a month. I'm kind of a nomad right now. I decided to get out of New York City during the pandemic and stop bleeding money.
Do you still have a place there?
No, I got rid of it.
Oh, okay.
I just didn't renew the lease. So I've been a bit of a gypsy, which has been great. I've managed to see, I've been in Alaska and Montana and California and Florida and Virginia and just Wyoming, every state you can imagine. Obviously Texas now. So it's been really great, and I've got to see so many different people, and I really love working remotely. I'm someone who doesn't, can't really stick to an office environment by any stretch of the imagination. So I've been running about and then just kind of doing a lot of work, I guess, in Mexico. It's been the easiest with the pandemic rather than trying to go abroad right now. So I really miss it and I can't wait to get back and just focusing on the writing stuff and sort of building that. And then I have my next couple of book projects I'm working on. Sort of wanting to delve more into, I guess, the psychology of, some of the stories you hear of just the most heinous things that people endure. And I'm fascinated by the psychology of what gets people through those, and how they survive just sort of the types of torture or the types of situations I couldn't even begin to imagine. And these are ordinary people without any training, without any skill, without any, nothing to draw from on that. And so that is something I'm hoping to probe over the next year or two, and then just building it up.
To me, I agreed. I'm fascinated. You see, it's similar to kind of the stories you see where like a grandma is with her granddaughter and a car runs over and she has the strength to pick it up, type of thing. Is that I think human beings are hardwired parasympathetically. I think to that when you're in a situation where they're really it's fight or flight and you can't flight, like you're going to fight because you're instinctually. I mean, the survivability of our species depends on people doing that, so I think some of that is kind of genetically hardwired, but it's still fascinating nonetheless. Do you find yourself claiming somewhere as being home in the next few years, or
yes, definitely. I'm hoping by the summer that I'll have a bit more of an idea. I guess, yeah, this with the pandemic, it really has forced us all to realize that we don't have to be in these cities anymore. And
Care to share where that might be, or is that secret?
you know, I wish I could give you an answer because I actually don't know yet. So yeah, I have, you know, I'm a beach girl again. I go back to my roots and think, well, you know, I'd love to be in Hawaii, but is that too far away from other work, or can I, you know, be there? Obviously Florida has some amazing beaches as well. And then part of me, you know, I'm totally okay with sort of more of a country style of things as well. But yeah, I just think it's time to kind of go back to some of those roots a little bit and be away from the city, slightly quiet. As long as I'm relatively close to an airport, that's important. And I'd like to go and spend a chunk of time in Australia because it's been a long time since I've been back, and I really miss my family, and I'd love to just be able to kind of go there and work from there and just be with them.
Yeah. Any bucket list items?
Bucket list items. I mean, still a lot of countries I need to go to. You know, for me, that's important.
Is there one thing that stands out as like, before I die, I have to do this?
I'd like to be a mom.
Yeah.
That's what I'd like to do.
Yeah.
I always think it's interesting when people immediately assume that, given the work that I do, that it must just be an impossible thing. But I can tell you from other women that do my profession, almost all of them have kids. And I think they manage it well. And I think it's also really important to tell these stories from the woman or from a mother's perspective, because you're going to get a very different read of a situation on the ground, from someone from that point of view than you probably are from if you're looking at, one of my, say, male colleagues who's more focused on the military aspect of things.
Yeah.
And I just think it's important to never lose both those perspectives.
Yeah, no, I think that's really both admirable and refreshing, I think, and that, there needs to be, not just from how you view things, but I think, people with your experiences and perspectives that are very well-rounded by comparison to most. I think it's really important to have kids and pass that on to them, because without that, you have a very one-dimensional, sheltered, perspectived society that way. But where can people find you online and all of that?
So my Instagram and my Twitter is just my name, HOLLIESMCKAY.
And before I let you go here, there is one question that I wanted to ask, and it pertains to your accent.
Yes.
And the way that you pronounce, the way that it's even heavier in Australia than it is with British
If you heard
English.
my dad talk, then you probably wouldn't understand him.
Well, so what's funny is like the Boston accent, right, is like a carryover rendition of the British accent. And then Australia and New Zealand are kind of somewhere in between, sort of. But I've always been curious about the pronunciation of an R at the end of words that end in A, like Australia or Virginia. Australia. So I had to go to these, I don't know why. My mom made me go to these sort of elocution lessons when I was a kid, and I was a nun, and she had a very strong sort of British accent, and I was never allowed to say, like most Australians will say, Australia. I had to sit there with a tape recorder and go, Australia, 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 Australia. So my accent's a little bit warped from all of that. I wonder if you maybe don't realize it. Like
I didn't even realize.
So when, if you listen to the interview, Zach, back it up. No, when you said Virginia and Australia, both of them, it was like Virginia. It was like It ends in an R.
Virginia.
Yeah.
I didn't even notice it. In Alaska and Montana and California and Florida and Virginia and just Wyoming, every state you can imagine. I'll notice it when I speak.
I've always wondered about that. A lot of words that end in A are pronounced like they end in an AR. It's really strange to me, but I was just curious if it sounds like it's subconscious.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Rock and roll. Miss McKay, I can't thank you enough for coming on. You've lived an extraordinary life already, and the stories in the book are gut-wrenching, but at the same time, really, really important for especially people in Western civilized, if you want to call them that, societies to gain that knowledge and understanding of just how lucky we are to live in a place where a lot of us, myself included, bitch regularly about things that we really have no business bitching about. And I think your book does a fantastic job at promoting a well-rounded, healthy perspective that will lead to appreciation for what we have, as opposed to the disdain that a lot of people show for it nowadays. So I also think it's really awesome that your forward is by Jocko and it's published under his new publishing company, newer publishing company. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, Jocko with D'Angelo Publications together. Yep.
But again, I really appreciate you carving out the time and staying a couple extra days to accommodate the schedule and sharing your story with us. It's been fascinating.
Thanks for having me. It's been an honor.
Oh, absolutely. I'd like to take a quick second to shout out and thank our sponsor for today's podcast, Origin Labs and Jocko Fuel. Jocko Fuel is a great product. He's got a ton of products actually within the Jocko Fuel line. The guests and I enjoy them on the show. And outside, I take a lot of the supplements. I've got some of the Origin Lab jeans, boots, gis, and it's just all around American industry. They do a fantastic job really re-revolutionizing American industry from start to finish. It's all American made, all American sourced. Everything start to finish is made right there in-house, and they really do a phenomenal job creating the products and fulfilling the whole ball of wax. They've been a huge supporter of the Mic Drop podcast for a while now, and I really can't thank Jocko Fuel and Origin Labs enough for the job that they do for us. And so thank you to you guys. I'd like to take a second to shout out our newest sponsor, which is Project Warpath. This is a Navy SEAL-owned company that provides apparel with a pretty edgy feel, and it's a good friend of mine that runs it out of California. And just overall a great outfit. They've got a whole line of different shirts. One of which is arguably my favorite, which is Epstein didn't kill himself. Wonder where that one came from. And but yeah, there's Hillary Clinton killed my friends. There's a bunch of pretty edgy and cool patriotic sayings on T-shirts with good design, good high quality, and it's one that I'm actually wearing right now. So I appreciate them sponsoring the show. Again, that's Project Warpath. You can get all their stuff online, and the shipping and customer service is top notch, quality product, and you're supporting a veteran-owned business. So shout out to Project Warpath. Go check their stuff out. I'd also like to say thank you to our other sponsor, Resilience Premium CBD. Resilience is excited to offer all Mic Drop listeners a 20% off discount on all products for 2 weeks from when this podcast is live, using the discount code MICDROP at checkout. That's 2 words, Mic Drop at checkout. I'd also like to say that Resilience is a great company that works in conjunction with Trico CBD, and all military veterans and first responders receive 35% off. Yes, that's 35% off for all military veterans and first responders, and that's through the Military and First Responders program. You just have to sign up at resilientcbd.com/military first responders discount. In terms of about Resilience, generally speaking, it's a premium CBD that I use. Again, it works in conjunction with the Tricos brand for the everyday athlete. That's www.resilientcbd.com. And Resilience was really born with the founders who are military veterans as well, personally experienced the effects and impact that CBD had on their own mental and physical obstacles. Their focus was sharper, mental stress was calmed, fitness stamina increased, and their bodies felt less pain, inflammation after super intense workouts. A lot of times most people and people are able to either wean off entirely or significantly reduce pain management therapy. This is a shared vision among the founders that this incredible supplement had not only changed their lives, but had the power to provide unbelievable benefits to family, friends, athletes, fellow veterans, and ultimately the entire fitness community. So big shout out to Resilience for their product as well as the Trico stuff. We sure appreciate their support. To you, the listener, because I haven't said it yet so far, 2 things. 1, choke yourself. 2 is that if you'll notice behind Miss McKay, there's our new addition to the studio, which is made by Veteran Wood Company, for those of you that are going to ask where it came from. He made this for me after seeing my abysmal coin display racks that I had when I did a tour of the studio a few months ago. And so he made that and presented it to me just a little bit ago. And we got all the coins put on there and hung up. And I could not be more thankful for him doing that. Again, that's Veteran Woodco on Instagram, but that's from him. Really, really neat way to display all the different guests and people that I've worked with and their coins. So shout out to him and the big announcement of him doing that. For you, the listener, I sure appreciate you guys tuning in show after show and making this what it is. Can't thank you enough. It wouldn't be a show without you. Again, thank you to Hollie for coming on, and we sure appreciate both of you guys. So without further ado, until next time, this is Mic Drop.